Okay, good morning, everybody. Or sorry, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for being here today. My name is Sarah Ladislaw. I direct the Energy and National Security Program here at CSIS. And we're very, very pleased to have such a large audience here for a special event that we are hosting with our friends at Ness Feldman. It's been quite a while in the making and was actually the brainchild of a brainstorm that we had with Shelley and Charlie, who I'll introduce in a moment, and our colleague Kyle Danish as well. And it is meant to do two different things. One is to talk about two really important and timely issues. Vehicle efficiency standards, both the origin of regulating efficiency in the automotive sector, and then also what's going to happen going forward, and also regulation within the electric power sector, issues that we cover and care about a great deal. But to do so in the spirit of honoring Bob Nordhaus, who passed away earlier this year, one of the things that we thought was important to do is to recognize the substance of the work of not only Bob, but people who dedicate themselves to the field of public service and the field of public policy making in the electric power sector and the energy sector more broadly. There's lots of people who do this, and we recognize them for their expertise and the contributions they make, and certainly want to do that on behalf of Bob. I'm going to leave to Charlie and to Shelley to share with you a little bit about Bob and his legacy and his work, but I just wanted to let you know the plan for today is after opening remarks, we'll have a panel of experts to talk about vehicle efficiency and emissions standards, where we think things will go from here, how we got to this point, what the benefits have been, what the costs have been, what some of the considerations are driving the future of the automotive sector. And then we'll take a 15-minute break. And then afterwards, we'll have another panel where we're just going to tackle all the issues in the electric power sector. That's meant to be a joke. In an hour and a half period of time, we're going to try and cover both the changes that are taking place within the electric power sector in the United States, but also some of the more recent regulatory issues that are at the fore of discussions right now. After that, we will have a reception right out here in the lobby area, which we hope that all of you will join us for. To those of you who decided to join us via webcast today, sorry, we haven't figured out how to tweet you a cocktail, so you'll have to show up here if you want to participate in the reception. So, as I said, turning to two of the colleagues that we were working with to put together today's event, and sort of need no introduction, but I'll introduce them anyway. Charlie Curtis, who is a senior advisor here at CSIS and president emeritus of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, former commissioner at FERC himself and longtime energy guru, and Shelley Fiedler, who's a principal at Ness Feldman. Just want to thank you both for your role in putting this really important discussion today. And maybe, Charlie, if you could start to tell us a little bit about Bob and why today's sort of substantive event honors some of the work that he did.
All right. Thank you. I first was introduced to Bob Nordhaus in 1970, and our professional and personal lives became entwined at that time. I had been at Treasury and the SEC and had gone to Capitol Hill with draft legislation to provide protection for brokers and dealers, customers who had deposited securities and cash with their brokers. I was accompanied by a legendary general counsel of the SEC, Phil Loomis, and a partner at Sullivan and Cromwell. And eventually we were directed over to talk to Bob Nordhaus about this legislation. He looked at the draft and 10 minutes later looked up and said, gentlemen, this really won't do. And he redrafted it. It became the Security Investor Protection Corporation Act, which today you see as SIPC. That was just one of the many consequential and enabling acts that Bob Nordhaus drafted in his career at the Hill. We all know that Bob drafted most of the major energy and environmental laws in that period from 1970 to onward to this century. He was an amazing man. He forgot nothing. He could answer any question on any subject. He was rarely at a loss for an answer and never at a loss for an answer about the law. When I know a number of people who knew Bob in this room would agree, he was the dominant legal mind in any meeting that he attended. He was an extraordinary man, a great lawyer, and a great friend. And I will always treasure that last attribute of our relationship, that friendship. He was an amazing, amazing friend. I want to tell a story that's somewhat relevant, especially to this discussion today. And it starts with the Yom Kippur War in 1973. That was October, sometimes referred to as the October War. At that time, gasoline was selling for quite a bit less than a gallon of water. So a gallon of gasoline was quite a bit less than a gallon of water. After the Yom Kippur War and the ensuing embargo, oil prices worldwide quadrupled. We developed shortages in in petroleum product, resulting in long lines and great frustration among those who were dependent upon petroleum product. Very disruptive for our economy, double-digit inflation, double-digit unemployment. It was a time of great social and economic stress. It was also a time of great political stress. On November 8th of that year, Richard Nixon, who was under significant political stress, went on television to announce to the nation that he needed stronger regulatory powers to address the energy crisis in our society. But he was not going to submit legislation to the Congress. He was going to depend upon the Congress to develop legislation which he would then enact, because he and his team were distracted by something called whitewater. Excuse me. Watergate.
Different water.
Sorry, Watergate. And John Ehrlichman happened to be President Nixon's energy advisor. And for those historians in the crowd, we all know John was busy on a lot of things. I was lead energy counsel at the House Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee, now the Energy and Commerce Committee. We went immediately to markup on legislation, no hearings. It was then a 43-member committee. There were 187 amendments offered in committee. Everybody's last bad idea on energy was put on the table, and 115 of those amendments to the bill were accepted. So we went to conference, and after a long and torturous circumstance, produced in December of '75 the Energy Policy and Conservation Act, which had, among other things, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the enabling legislation to turn right on red, which is something we all do when we go home tonight, and a path forward to remove price controls on oil and petroleum product, which were in effect from the Economic Stabilization Act that had imposed price controls across the economy and had not been removed when the Yom Kippur War broke out and the embargo resulted in the price and spike in shortages. Fuel economy was just coming into focus. Remember, I said that gasoline was cheaper than water. Actually, with bottled water, it may be cheaper than water today. So it was not a focus of the legislative mind until after the Yom Kippur War and the long lines and the large spike in petroleum product prices. And that created an opportunity for that legislation and the crafting by Shelley and Bob and Phil Sharp, who's here, of the fuel efficiency standards, which Shelley will talk about in her remembrances. All I wanted to do, leave you the thought of, is when you go home tonight and drive your safer, less cost to repair and more fuel efficient cars, I want you to remember Bob Nordhaus. He was an extraordinary man who did much for our society and for making this nation stronger in energy security and in environmental security. And thank you, Sarah, for hosting at CSIS this important discussion, which begins with the memory of this important man. Shall we?
So I was going to start to say, how does one talk about a legend? But I'm also sitting next to one. So you got a chance to hear a little bit from Charlie. And how can we communicate to an audience genuinely interested and active in the areas we will talk about today? Because we're here to talk about policy, legislation, and regulation. Bob, as you've already heard, was at the front end on each policy that we're talking about today and involved in every dimension of these issues. And thanks for the title, Sarah, past, present, and even future. That's the reason we celebrate him here. And we at Van Ness are thrilled to partner with Sarah Ladislaw and CSIS, where debate in the best sense still thrives, conversation matters, and ideas and solutions to very real challenges are tested and socialized. So thank you. I was only one of Bob Nordhaus's staff clients in the House, or rather, the staff of one of his more active elected clients, then Congressman Phil Sharp, my beloved boss of 20 years. Charlie Curtis had a virtual think tank operating at the Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee, ready to create an entire body of new law, of analysis of problems new to the legislative branch in 1974, the first year after the Arab oil embargo. And although Charlie's told you something about what had to happen to make that happen, it's really important to report to you all that until early 1975, there was not a single committee or subcommittee in the Congress with energy as its major jurisdiction. Now there are dozens, so we were really starting from scratch. The Congress poured out legislation in those active 2+ decades, and we all together learned issues, drafted legislation, and thinking skills from our leaders, both congressional and senior staff. Fuel economy standards, which we used to call CAFE, does anybody call it CAFE anymore? And electricity through PURPA and other means were two of the deep dives by the committee. Bob continued to work on both issues at the White House, at FERC, and at the Department of Energy. He tackled these issues with curiosity, integrity, collegiality, and a plan. Before we dig in here with the panels, I want to mention what must be obvious but should be noted. Bob and Charlie were incredible mentors. The Personnel and Commerce Committee staffs on the House side were schooled and nurtured by both of them. Charlie convinced some of his mentees to go to law school. Susan Tomasky, former general counsel at FERC, and Debbie Gottheil, later of FERC, and Van Ness Feldman were two. They went to law school at night. This particular art and theater major demurred. Bob, and I hope Charlie, tolerated my perfidy and helped me to shape my work and expertise so that I could be used and useful, even if not a lawyer. Thank you.
Especially because...
That's what Bob used to say.
Yeah, that's right.
So we handed out a biography of Bob at the tables, and at the back of the biography is a bibliography, which I wanted to call to people's attention. So the bibliography itself, and thank you, Kyle Danish, for doing this, provides, it points out both the mentoring and the generosity of Bob Nordhaus. These are examples of publications and legal briefs and policy discussions that Bob wrote. He chose young people. Thank goodness one of them even includes me. But most often with assistance from a young lawyer he thought could do good work. And frankly, so they have done, all of them. As an adjunct at 2 area law schools, partnering with congressional agency or law firm colleagues, always with a partner, some of them here today, he began a people pipeline into the practice of energy and environmental law that has enriched the intellect walking the halls of Congress, companies, agencies, and at Van Ness Feldman for 40 years. So thanks to you all for attending today, and I'm really eager to hear the discussion of these issues, which started almost 50 years ago and still are relevant today.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Shelley.
Shall we march?
Well, hopefully with that sort of grounding for everybody who maybe didn't know Bob or didn't know the context in which we're holding the discussions today, I'd like to invite the first panel led by Kyle Danish, who deserves a ton of credit for putting today's event together. And also we benefit from being a senior associate in the energy program at CSIS to come up with his panel, and we will exit off the panel as well.
Exit
so
stage.
Please come on up.
Thank you, everybody, for coming today. This first panel is going to talk about transportation policy. And the title of this program, The Past, Present, and Future of U.S. Energy Policy, I think is particularly fitting for this panel insofar as with transportation policy, it's really sort of, in my mind, impossible to understand some of the current legal and policy issues with which people are wrestling without an appreciation of how the sort of critical foundational laws came into place and how they came into conflict over new issues, whether it was fuel economy, sort of a foundational issue, and then greenhouse gas emissions, a new issue that came onto the scene over time. And so this, consistent with that approach, we're going to start this panel by walking first through the history of these issues, and then bring us to today's disputes and issues and things that we're trying to work with. We have a very good panel for this purpose. To my left, your right, is Phil Sharp, a former member of Congress, fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy, an adjunct faculty member at Georgetown University. To the right of Phil is Megan Soronsky.
Phil's left, they're right.
To the left of Phil, merely in positioning and not necessarily in political views.
We
So
haven't
we have
figured it out
Megan
yet.
Soronsky, who's a former special assistant to the president and associate counsel in the executive office of the president. And then we have Adam Szyminski here at CSIS, the James R. Schlesinger Chair for Energy and Geopolitics. And then finally, all the way to the end there, David Schweidert, who is the Executive Vice President for Federal Government Affairs at the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers. So, Phil, let me start with you to get us grounded in the critical history in this area.
Well, thanks, Kyle. Let me take you back to 1975, probably before you were born, certainly before Sarah was born, and looks like before about half the audience.
I will not correct the record.
It looks like about half the audience was not born at that time. So we're going back to a glorious time in which Americans love their Congress. Now, if you believe that, if you're not laughing, you're way out of it, kind of proposition. But what you want to remember in 1975 is we had an election, a congressional off-year election in 1974. And as a consequence of the revolt of the American people against their president, who they had just reelected 2 years before with great fanfare and with enormous outpouring of electoral college votes, they decided to revolt, throw him out of office first, but revolt against him and his party, and in swept a huge bunch of new members of Congress, including myself. There were 92 new members of the House of Representatives that year, not quite 1/4. 75 were Democrats. And for those of us who were selecting committees, as Charlie called it, the Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee, now the Energy and Commerce Committee, had 14 openings on the Democratic side. I tell that story and no member of Congress today could believe that opportunity existed. And so there were 5 or 6 of us that were brand new. This will become relevant in a moment. But at that point, Charles Curtis was in the extremely important position of general counsel. Harley Staggers was chairman, but John Dingell had just gotten elected chairman of the Energy and Power Subcommittee. And from there on, for the rest of the next multiple decades, his ascent and his power on most of these issues was phenomenal, and I had the pleasure of being tutored by him, manipulated by him, used by him, and happy in many cases to support him, and Cafe is one of those. But also, of course, Shelley Fiddler, who was on my staff, as she said, she worked with Bob Nordhaus very directly on the original drafting of the fuel economy standards called CAFE at that time, because Bob was present at the creation, and indeed he was very much responsible for the creation in the legal language of what became the CAFE standards. It was adopted first in the subcommittee, one of the amendments offered in the Energy and Power Subcommittee. I had the honor of offering it. Shelley had ginned me up to do it. Dingell probably was behind the scenes manipulating the puppetry. And Bob did the business, and then I did the business of offering the thing, and it was adopted. The goal at that time that we were driving with, which Charlie partly has mentioned, was the fact that the country was almost in a panic and fear over oil disruptions as a result of the '73 oil crisis. Mm-hmm. What was viewed to be at stake was our economics. What was viewed to be at stake was our national security. And frankly, it was a real blow to a high self-image that we had in America about our role in international affairs, that nobody could do this to us now because we were riding on top of the world. And so it was a shattering experience that led to this, among many other kinds of activities. So it was driven by the fear of dependence on foreign oil and the consequences for economics and security. Likewise, in 2007, when the Congress takes the issue up again for the first serious time to redesign the program, that was the fundamental motivation or the fundamental goal that they were, again, working toward. Now, if we fast forward, though, to 2009 under the Obama administration, and more importantly, 2011, which is the grand bargain that this will get to with the state of California, with a whole host of automakers and the United Auto Workers, and those are the standards we're operating under right now, kind of thing. The goal changed, and this is a very significant change. The goal became, for many people, not oil dependence, although that argument is always brought up. What the real goal was climate, reduction of CO2. And energy efficiency in the auto sector leads to reductions in CO2, and these these goals became, or these techniques of policy became attached. But they certainly were not attached in 1975, although the environmentalists were very much for the goals at that time, but not for climate. They were for it because they knew that the tailpipe standards, which were reducing the conventional pollution, would be you would get less pollution per mile if you were using less gasoline. Well, what I want to focus on a little bit here is what I call the power of price. Charlie and I think Shelley alluded to this radical rise, unexpected rise in gasoline, oil prices. Oil, it was a much broader thing. It fed through many parts of the economy, but gasoline was the focus here, and it was a huge rise. And by the way, the fear that there would be more disruptions and the price rise was inevitably going higher. And in fact, many analysis inside the industry and the government and academia said prices have only got one way to go. Totally defying Economics 101, but that was the way the world was headed at that time, kind of proposition. Well, that price increase in 1973, 74, whatever, that energized hugely the markets, and it energized American politics. The markets suddenly were having the consumers say, you know what, I like that Volkswagen. It has really the best fuel economy at that time. I think it was probably the Bug. I had one previously running for office. After that, it had to be American-made in my district. But the point was they were starting to import, and the consumer was turning toward, in desperation, for anything that would help, and suddenly took a real interest in fuel economy. And the American companies had decided that, we don't need to worry about Volkswagen and others. We've got a few cars that are in the lower ranges, but fuel economy is not high on our priority list. And so suddenly they were jolted. The United Auto Workers was severely jolted by this, because what they feared was the influx of constant more imports, and by the way, that meant less jobs in American plants. The kind of proposition. And by the way, prices are a blowtorch on the rear end of Congress. I can promise you, you can forget about partisan commitment, forget about ideological commitment, forget about last year's speeches. When those prices go up, people suddenly say, whoa, how can I do something? Some are very sincere about doing something, and others are saying, how can I save that blowtorch, keep it off my rear end? And so they move, and they move rapidly. Again, likewise, that's what happened in 2007, is the prices had been rising since 2004, and it was driving people and politics crazy, and certainly helped President Obama win that election in 2008. One other thing I want to add in, though. Charlie mentioned that there had not been the extensive hearings that later we had hearings forever and ever, but there was one difference that I would really like to point out, and it's relative to CAFE. I could not find the history to figure out. But there was a major report that I believe the committee or somebody in the government had asked for to say, how can we figure out a policy for getting fuel economy in this country? And so there was real analysis, real efforts at thinking through, not by some quick me or some junior person that hadn't ever dealt with these issues. There was solid analysis there. Now, whether you buy it or don't buy it, The point is, an effort was made to be intellectually sound at the beginning, and Bob Nordhaus, he certainly read it, I used it in the speeches and whatnot, kind of proposition. Well, guess what? When we get to 2007, there have been lots of academic and other analyses done on this over and over, some of it favorable to CAFE, some of it disparaging of CAFE, but there were major proposals out there which become the design change, and that's one of the big things that happens in 2007, huge design change in this policy. The National Academy of Sciences just one among them, but it was a panel in 2001 that endorsed this kind of substantive change. At that time, and by the way, my predecessor at RFF, Paul Portney, who was president of Resource Theory, he was head of that panel for the National Academy of Sciences back in 2001, and I know that's something you'll want to remember and write down, kind of proposition. Well, let me mention back in 1975, three key provisions that become significant later. There are lots of provisions, I'm not even going to attempt to get there, but in the design of this that seem to matter over time. The first is its corporate fleet. And that was designed after the nature of our industry at the time. We were the big three. The big three companies, they all had multiple designs of smaller to larger, even though they weren't very fuel efficient, kind of proposition. So this fit the structure of the market and the structure of our industry, and therefore was something they could deal with. And by the way, it made it a little harder for those foreign companies to come in. They were not running multiple lines, so most of them had to end up paying penalties in order to be in the marketplace, unless they were really on the low end of fuel economy. But significantly, that also meant that this structure told GM and Ford and Chrysler that you've got to average out your big inefficient cars and your lower efficient cars to get your average, okay? So what's the pressure? The pressure is to push yourself to build more small cars and push them out into the marketplace. This is something the United Auto Workers and others loved because they felt it was a way to make sure we kept American companies in the market on the small end. And by the way, it's long been the history that in general, the companies were making a lot more money out of the big fancy car than they were able to make per investment on the smaller cars. The second feature to mention is, so what did we do about light duty trucks? We had this little debate and an amendment was adopted in the subcommittee of Energy and Power, was, well, this CAFE standard stuff looks like this fleet standard works on the auto sector. But we got all those light trucks, the ones that in my district, the young men drove on the farms, the old men drove them too, and the women knew how to drive them, though they were not always allowed to drive, but it wasn't that bad back then. But close. Saudi Arabia doesn't have a lot. Anyway, the point is that we recognized, but it was not with great analysis, that there was a problem here that it might not fit in this. And so there's a weight difference that determined between light duty and that. And what we did is we said, good idea, let's give that problem to the Department of Transportation. NHTSA became the agency that did it, and let them decide on what those standards are with the expectation that they would not be as high, but they would be progressive and they would move them up. And besides that, in my area, my sort of sense of it was that, you know, any young woman being courted by one of the farm boys wasn't really eager to be taken to the dance in the pickup truck. So you didn't have to worry about the whole world moving over into the truck. But this becomes what later critics called the loophole in the thing, because the automakers figured it out, the regulators allowed it, and that was to suddenly be able to shift various makes of what we would call autos, vans, and SUVs into that category, requiring less advancement. And that kind of undermined the general direction from the point of view of trying to accomplish the goal. The third feature that is still there, but it was the business that you have to remember in '75, it had only been a few years since the country had dramatically intervened in the auto marketplace to impose safety requirements. So there were a whole host of safety requirements and investments. It was only a few years previous that they had imposed these new tailpipe standards, which were a huge intervention into the marketplace, requiring them to spend their money and times, and they blew it in the first, one of the companies blew it in the first round of catalytic converters, and everybody said, oh, this will never work, and everything like that. That was BS, of course, of the first order, and they learned how to do it, and they invested, and now it works very successfully. But now we were talking about, we got a third idea for you. So that you have to face these regulations, and now you got to face fuel economy regulations, and there was a fair question to be asked from their engineers and others is, wait a minute, how do these all add up? Because they may work against each other, and they do to some, in theory, they can. So one of the things that, this is not to solve that problem, but that was the pushback, but it was to say, for God's sake, if you're going to have fuel efficiency standards, only have the federal government do it. Stop. And this is one of the few places in federal law where there's an absolute preemption against any city, any state government getting into the business of fuel economy standards. And by the way, it'd be very hard, well, it'd be interesting to see whether they can, into this Congress, they could get a preemption on anything. On the one hand, there's a massive impulse for that, but on the other hand, if you believe in states' rights, you can't buy into a federal preemption. Anyway, so this, of course, becomes quite relevant much later when the state of California decides to take on climate change. And one pillar of climate change is the transportation sector, and one of the main techniques of dealing with it is fuel efficiency requirements. So the state of California, after a lot of wrangling and there were multiple courses, they became very clever, and they legally made the case, oh, we're not regulating fuel economy. We're regulating under the Clean Air Act. We are regulating what comes out of the tailpipe standard, and CO2 is coming out, and we have a right to do that because guess what? The Clean Air Act happens to have a special state waiver only for California and anybody who adopts California standards. And so this takes us way forward, and I'm not going to take us there, but this federal preemption almost blocks California from taking action until they learned to very skillfully, and they were very, very careful in their speeches, in their the legal briefs and everything. Say, oh no, we're not regulating efficiency, we are regulating CO2, and they of course had a major impact. Well, let me just go back one more shot at 2005 to what happened, because I find it interesting because I was there, in 2005 into the House of Representatives on the floor of the House. Because it's a very, very unusual, I'm used to teaching students this, very unusual situation that developed. You had from us in the Energy and Commerce Committee the proposal to adopt this regulatory system for advancing fuel economy. But the Ways and Means Committee on that same bill, they were doing tax things, they came out with an alternative way to do it, in which was to have a gas guzzler tax. In other words, let's put a heavy tax on the cars that are less efficient, and if you are willing to pay that tax, okay, but chances are you're going to want to avoid that tax, and you'll buy down, and the country will buy down. And so this was a massive fight. It's complicated too by, you've got the Commerce Committee against the Ways and Means Committee, and I know the whole world doesn't care about that, but I can assure you the chairman and the members of this committee care about that, kind of, as does all the interests outside who think they have a better relationship with the Commerce Committee or a better relationship with the Ways and Means Committee. But the remarkable thing is, you almost never get in the House of Representatives a genuine, legitimate argument between two major alternative ways to do something. There are policies. Sometimes somebody will offer an amendment to do that, but this was serious business. And of course, we won on the Commerce Committee, and that is the CAFE standards. But also note politically, and by the way, Ford and Chrysler indirectly supported this. The UAW was hot for this, and General Motors, as always, was, oh, this disgusting federal government, will they never stop? But the key thing here is that from the United Auto Workers perspective, and from jobs in my district and other districts, was, if we put on a gas guzzler tax, who does that benefit? Volkswagen will have even a better shot at bringing in, because all the GM cars will have a tax on them, and the foreign cars will be able to come in under this, and so it creates that. Now, if you'll forgive me one more, and then I'll shut up. One more little piece that's more of interest, because I went to RFF, which is right over here, after many years after I left Congress. I became president of RFF. Well, I was involved in CAFE then. The other person in the House of Representatives offering the amendment for gas guzzler tax was Joe Fischer, who had been vice president at Resources for the Future. Now, notice, Joe was a freshman, I was a freshman. This was unheard of in the history of the Congress, but it would recognize the wisdom of our leaders, John Dingell and I can't remember who was Ways and Means at that time, but they said, you know, you got all those new members of Congress I referred to, they might be more inclined to go along with one of their own, especially we had caucused and we'd become a fairly cohesive group. And so they said, how about you, Phil, offering this? How about you, Joe, offering this? And we were out there in unbelievable territory in which freshmen were not to be heard or seen, frankly, up until that time. So I'm not claiming great credit for having been out there. I'm not stupid. I know, I now know, I wasn't so sure then, what was going on as a way to try to make this work in the Congress. But also, and so I just wanted to mention what happened to Phosphor. Let me just quickly, just fast forward a couple comments and then we'll get, and I apologize, I'll get off of this. In 2007, when they finally re-legislate, we have a Republican president, George Bush. He supports it. Many of the Republicans in the Congress supported it, and certainly Democrats supported it. So you had bipartisan support. You obviously had this price as a big driver, and you get, which we'll probably talk about, and I know Dave knows a lot about, the redesign of the structure, which makes it more flexible, more adjusted to the modern market, and therefore was more favorable toward the let me say, more acceptable to the automakers kind of thing. Not that they loved it or necessarily endorsed it. Let me make one more comment about today and the radical transformation of the international arena and the auto and transportation sector. If you read in the last week, the last 2 or 3 weeks, we have heard announcements out of Britain, out of France. I think there was one other European country in which they said, we're beginning to set target dates for totally phasing out the internal combustion engine for climate reasons, and we're going to electrify, which, by the way, only works if you've got electricity that is not generating, not as coal-driven, okay? The kind of thing. But China, very significantly, they weighed in on this as well and said, we are trying to figure out what date we should set for the phase out of the internal combustion engine. And their issue is not really climate so much, although it has climate benefits. Their issue is the massive problem they face in all their major cities of normal pollutants that we regulate, called tailpipe standards, and they're moving. So what is happening today is we're having an argument right now in the midterm review on fuel economy standards of what to do, and California is back in the potential driver's seat again. We'll see. Those are issues we can talk about later. But what I wanted to mention to you is no longer are we the lead industry or are we the lead policymakers that we were at the time of 1975. And that isn't all bad. Some of the older generation regret that deeply and they feel like America is no longer great. But the fact is that the market in China is driving so that General Motors announced their whole plan is to go to a very broad-based electrification of their cafe standards. Well, that's not because Americans are rushing out to suddenly electrify everything, although that's important. It's because that Chinese market and other markets around the world are heading in that direction. So we're now integrated into a quite different economy and a quite different environmental structure in the world in which we need to, in my view, be participants and lead, but we have to recognize that in a lot of it, we're going to benefit from the solar policy in China. We're going to benefit from the fuel economy in China, in my view, from an environmental point of view. Anyway, sorry.
No, that's great. Thank you, Phil. Nothing better than having a review of the laws by a lawmaker who made them.
A non-lawyer, by the way, which was another oddity.
It's okay, you know, more art history majors throughout the ranks is important. That's not your major. But I'd like to, we're going to talk some more about some of the international and other market issues you've identified. I'd like to pick up the history that you had going there up to about 2007. I'm going to look down to you, Dave. We're here in 2007. Sure. George Bush and the Congress have set free NHTSA, right, to create new fuel economy standards. California is moving forward with its greenhouse gas standards for vehicles. Things start to happen from there. Why don't you take the story?
No, that's a wonderful springboard, and I know the Congressman certainly laid things out. For purpose of a context, obviously a lot was happening back in the 70s in terms of the oil embargo. Two things that I want to emphasize before we kind of speed up to the mid-2000s is when Congress and the Congressman himself crafted the 75 Act, one of the two underpinnings that are most important, and these are going to come full circle, was that it was based on not only one aspect, but really a handful of aspects. So Congress had a lot of vision as it relates to ensuring that anything that was set under the corporate average fuel economy standards actually took into account not only fuel economy, but also how that impacted the economic practicability of such standards, but then also to ensure that such standards were actually not just affordable, but also didn't compromise other critical priorities like auto safety. So when Congress delegated to the Department of Transportation to work on fuel economy, they vested that authority through NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, to ensure that as they juggled fuel economy, they were also taking into account the impact on consumers as it related to the overall safety of the vehicle, which is kind of their mission number one. So that's one thing. Secondly, with respect to the Act back in '75, Congress in its wisdom at the time actually included a very important provision, and it basically says that Congress at no one time, or the federal government for that matter, can look more than 5 years into the future to try to establish what fuel economy looks like, because obviously in its infinite wisdom, either at the congressional standpoint or even at agencies, it's very difficult to forecast into the future, particularly as it relates to industries that rely heavily as it relates to a time horizon when it comes to investment decisions and manufacturing. You don't just decide overnight that you're going to make a new model. Obviously, there's a lot of lead time that goes into that. So I just wanted to really emphasize that 75 Act included two key aspects. One, the 5-year statutory time frame to ensure that anything that Congress does is actually practicable. And then secondly, obviously that it's grounded in looking at more than just one thing when it comes to fuel economy, fuel efficiency. And obviously the CAFE standards were created at a time to really address domestic oil issues as it relates to dependency. So we're going to fast forward a little bit. We talked, I know the Congressman laid out, there were some competing interests going on in the early 2000s. Back in 2002, California passed legislation that basically sought to regulate greenhouse gases. And as the Congressman noted, there's actually a provision in the Clean Air Act, Section 209, that allows California, for historical reasons, to seek waivers, but they don't get those waivers automatically. California has to petition EPA to seek such authority to regulate greenhouse gases. And that authority under Section 209 basically stipulates that any state or California can seek to do so long as it's as stringent as the federal standard. So in 2002, California passes that bill. It takes a little while for them to try to implement it, but of course it's contingent upon a waiver. And during that time, you have the Bush administration in power, and obviously here in Washington, if not once, more than once, they rejected that California application, which then resulted in an ultimate petition to the Supreme Court, Massachusetts versus EPA, that was decided back in, if I remember right, 2007, while the Bush administration was still in office. So we'll come back to that in a second. But in 2007, this is terribly important. Not only was Congress dealing with, I believe you called the blowtorch effect, is that right?
That's going to be the thing I think that everybody remembers. So go ahead, Dave.
It was that good.
You'll remember.
Yeah, I couldn't resist. But obviously at that time, both 2004, 2005, 2006, a lot was happening, not only as it relates to domestic oil dependency, but in terms of consumer prices at the pump. I was on the Hill for 16 years and I witnessed it, not only during the 05 energy bill, but the 07 energy bill. But Congress was also working on a number of things to try to lessen our dependence. It wasn't just on domestic production, it was also on things like biofuels policy. That was the origins of both the RFS, the Renewable Fuel Standard in 05 and 07, which grew to 36 billion gallons. But the other thing that was going on around that time, as Congress was dealing with all this, was, as I said, that California petition. So we're going to speed up a little bit. The Bush administration leaves office, Obama administration comes to office. We had the Supreme Court case that basically said, for purposes of greenhouse gases, the Environmental Protection Agency is allowed to, under the Clean Air Act, make a determination about whether or not greenhouse gases pose a risk to human health. And Obama administration came into office, granted that California waiver, went down the path to create an endangerment finding. And automakers, our members at the Auto Alliance, we have 12 leading automakers that account for about 3/4 of the US market. They basically were faced with kind of a three-headed beast. They had California, who wanted to effectively set higher standards. They had EPA at the federal level that also wanted to regulate something that wasn't otherwise articulated in the Clean Air Act. And then you had CAFE through the Department of Transportation. And under the Clean Air Act, in addition to California being able to seek a waiver or being granted a waiver, other states, they're called 177 states under that section of the Clean Air Act, can also follow suit. So once California indicated that they wanted to regulate at a higher standard, there were 13 other states that eventually said, hey, me too. We want to follow your lead. And like I said, that created a three-headed monster in effect. And if you were to look at those 13 states, they account for roughly 1/3 of the US market. So you can imagine auto manufacturers are sitting back saying, oh my goodness, what are we going to do here? We want to make one vehicle that we can sell in all 50 states and territories because of just the economic practicability of that type of production. But with California getting a waiver, a Supreme Court case that is leading to increased regulation, the Obama administration effectively coordinated through California Air Resources Board, the US Department of Transportation, and the EPA basically to stipulate an agreement. It was called One National Program. So this is 2009. The 2009 agreement is looking 5 years into the future. It's seeking to set fuel economy standards not only in 2011 through 2016, but then California, after that agreement was put into place, said, you know what, we liked the direction this was going, we'd like to go further. And California was attempting to regulate at an even higher standard. So that resulted in another agreement in 2011, One National Program 2. It was a joint final rule between not only NHTSA, EPA, but also California that stipulated fuel economy standards for 2017 through 2025. Well, you might wonder why auto manufacturers might be interested in signing up for a second round of One National Program. Well, it was really, there was two underpinnings to it. One is that, as I mentioned earlier, obviously it's contingent upon the statutory requirement of a 5-year term. Secondly, there's tremendous benefit of having one standard for compliance. And secondly, the One National Program that was entered into in 2011 stipulated that partway through there would be what would be known as a midterm review, basically an ability for the federal government and California to step back and to evaluate whether or not some of the assumptions that were built into those standards from 17 through 25 were still viable. So those were the two underpinnings really that resulted in auto manufacturers coming to agreement with the Obama administration, DOT, and CARB to effectively situate what fuel economy looked like. So you might wonder why this is all important today. Well, it comes full circle because under the previous administration, last summer around July, they released what was the starting document of that process for the midterm review. It was called the Draft Technical Assessment Report. It was basically an itemization of the assumptions that were previously assumed to determine the degree to which those assumptions were still valid. So that process opened up a comment period. It went through the Office of Management and Budget, and so that was summer of last year. I'm going to speed up a little bit. The election took place. And during that time, there was attempts not only by auto manufacturers, our association, and others trying to extend the comment period that was somewhat limited. And we kept testifying before Congress and working with agencies, and they said, well, don't worry, this is just the start of the process. There's going to be ample time for comment. So our attempts to get the comment period extended by 30, 60 days were rebuffed. The presidential election happens in November, and by the end of the month, we're on the phone with the White House, EPA, and DOT, and they're saying, we just wanted to give you a heads up that tomorrow we're going to issue what is known as a proposed determination for the greenhouse gas standards for model years 22 to 25. And we said, what? I thought this was supposed to be occurring next year. And if you were to look on the last day of the month in November on EPA's website, there was a very clear timeline of the manner in which the draft technical assessment report and a potential final determination were going to be made. The next day, that timeline was taken off their website. So auto manufacturers are sitting back saying, wait a minute here, you know, the whole purpose of the midterm review was to not only align the fuel economy standards, but also to ensure that the greenhouse gas standards were one and the same. Well, what happened with that proposed determination at the end of November of last year after the election is that they did a very abbreviated comment period. Literally, we asked for an extension of 30 days, denied. We sought various other means to extend or stop it, denied. So literally, they took comment in 30 days. That process did not go through OMB. It was totally bypassed. Obviously, a lot had changed from the original assumptions back in 2011. As you can imagine, certain projections assumed a degree of high fuel prices well into the future. Well, you know what? As a result of a host of things Congress did, including back in a few years ago, they lifted the oil export ban. Obviously, we had a lot of domestic production that led to fracking and kind of an increased domestic resilience as it relates to petroleum products. And as a result, fuel prices aren't what they were assumed to be right now. And that was just one of the underpinnings that auto manufacturers and others said, well, wait a minute, if the whole purpose of the midterm review is to have a fact-based standardized process to evaluate whether or not certain assumptions are still valid, then we should have that, you know, in full disclosure and in a transparent process. So the final determination on greenhouse gases was made literally 1 week before the inauguration in January. EPA makes the determination that they're going to go final with those greenhouse gas decisions. Now keep in mind, you might say, remember how I talked about how CAFE and Department of Transportation can only look at fuel economy 5 years into the future? Well, how on earth can EPA say that the greenhouse gas standards are final if NHTSA hasn't even started the notice of proposed rulemaking to determine the feasibility of future corporate average fuel economy, which, by the way, under the agreement is effectively has to be established under a maximum feasible. So that's kind of full circle how we got from the 70s to today. Interestingly, a lot of people say, well, the auto sector and others are attempting to roll back the fuel economy standards for 22 to 25. Nothing further could be the case. The underpinnings of the agreement were to have a fact-based midterm review, to have one national program, and all we're trying to do is ensure that that process plays out. So this past March, the Trump administration, President Trump is inaugurated, the cabinet is situated. Mid-March, they make a decision that it was actually a presidential event that occurred in Michigan. It was both the president, DOT Secretary Lane Chow, as well as EPA Administrator Pruitt, attended an event in Michigan with automakers and others, basically announcing that they were going to put the midterm review back on track. Automakers, as well as the administration, as we understand it, has no preconceived notion of what the future fuel economy should be between 22 and 25. But at the same time, they recognize the hasty decisions that were made after the election to speed up what otherwise was supposed to be a collaborative, thoughtful process. Now, I'm not trying to diminish some of the interest as it relates to California seeking to go higher, and some people will say, well, the agreement's the agreement. Well, there's a lot of caveats to that agreement. The agreement's based on not only the midterm review, but also a host of other factors which, you know, we believed were effectively bypassed. Some folks will say, well, I thought that agreement said that manufacturers will, you know, meet 54.5 miles per gallon as an average by 2025. Well, that's not necessarily true either. The agreement back in 2011 stipulated that that was the goal based on the fleet mix at the time. But as you can imagine, consumer driving habits and purchase preference have changed. There was a certain degree of assumption as it relates to cars versus light-duty trucks. And you know what's happened over that period of time? They've actually flipped. More consumers are actually shifting to mid-size SUVs and crossover vehicles, and as a result, that 54.5 miles per gallon is actually roughly around 51 miles per gallon right now. And it's always supposed to be fluid because it's based on composition of the fleet. And with that note, I think I'll conclude, but before I do, I know this was something that the congressman pointed out. He was talking about a potential loophole as it related to the regulation of light-duty vehicles versus trucks. Well, one of the things that happened back in 2007 was when Congress passed the energy bill under the Bush administration, Congress also reformed the corporate average fuel economy program. So it was no longer an average of light-duty trucks versus cars. It was actually a footprint-based standard that then actually, of all things, led to the Obama administration speeding up what Congress had otherwise done to resituate the CAFE program. So the 07 energy bill includes CAFE reforms. The agreement between California DOT and the administration in 2009 basically sped up what otherwise Congress had done. And that's really interesting with all of this. As you can imagine, Congress is sitting back, somewhat being excluded from this whole process. Last time Congress touched corporate average fuel economy is 2007. They've never formally touched greenhouse gases as it relates to automobiles because that was something that flowed from the Massachusetts versus EPA case in 2007 that otherwise has effectively played out through one national program and joint final rules. So I guess I'll end there. There's plenty more to talk about from our context, but hopefully that shows you the degree to which auto manufacturers and others aren't necessarily seeking to stop progress. Today, there's more fuel-efficient vehicles than ever before. The average age of a vehicle on the road in the US is 11 and a half years. But also something that's also important to keep in mind is that if you look at the number of fatalities on our roadways, while vehicle miles traveled may have tripled since the late 50s, the interesting thing is that fatalities as an average compared to vehicle miles traveled has plummeted. But the last 2 years they've gone up. NHTSA just released the latest fatality numbers about 2 weeks ago, and last year, 2016, they itemized that there was over 37,461 people that died as a result of automobile fatalities on our roadways. And that's important to keep in mind as it relates to fuel economy regulations really drive what consumers are able to afford. There's a lot of things transformatively that are happening in the auto sector, not only on the efficiency side, but on the safety side. And that ultimately comes back to the fact that when the previous administration said that the final determination was going to be status quo with the numbers that they picked back in 2011, one of the concerning parts that we had with that analysis was that it failed to take into account the consumer acceptance and affordability. If you were to look at consumer trends over the last few years, does anybody want to guess how many vehicles as a percent account for plug-in electric or hybrid vehicles? Anybody want to take a guess? That's right, 3%. It's 3% of all vehicles sold in the US last year. All-time record sales, 17.55 million, 7th year of record growth. Last year there were less than 3% of all vehicles sold were electric, plug-in electric, and hybrid. Hybrids have actually declined compared to some other technologies, but the auto industry and our members are almost to some degree the victims of their own success, because if the average age of a vehicle is 11 and a half years, a consumer and their family are going in to trade in a vehicle. If you're just to trade like for like vehicle, say a sedan for another sedan, you're going to witness at least a 20%, if not more, improvement in fuel economy, in addition to a host of safety features and other things that you may need for your family or your lifestyle. So one of the challenges right now as a result of California plus EPA plus DOT is that with the inclusion of greenhouse gases, unless we ensure that the practicability of those standards are achievable both in terms of compliance but also for customer and affordability and acceptance, we're going to be missing an opportunity to help drive down the fatality rates as it relates to auto safety. There's a high correlation between automobile fatalities on the roadway and the age of the vehicle. 94% of all fatalities on the road are attributable to human error. So the big three, of course, are drunk driving, speeding, and seatbelt use. But beyond that, you're looking at a host of other government regulations and mandates over the years under NHTSA that have helped drive down some of those safety numbers. But this is just my point of saying that unless you take a full accounting of what's happening in the auto ecosystem, other interesting point to close with, I mean it this time, is that the average price of a vehicle is roughly $34,000. But also there's interesting things going on. Roughly a third of all auto purchasers are leasing vehicles. Mm-hmm. So they're effectively, remember how I said we've had 7 years of record growth? Well, that growth has been fueled by super low interest rates. And obviously we can't expect interest rates to remain where they are in perpetuity. But at the same time, household incomes have stagnated, if not dropped. They're rising a little bit now. But as consumers are looking to buy a vehicle, those vehicles are, on average costing more, somewhat due to regulation, somewhat due to features that they want. But unless you're taking into account how that impacts the consumer, you're really not going to achieve success in terms of viability. So at the end of the day, automakers aren't saying that we have a magic number of what compliance should be, but we do know based on customer acceptance, remember the 3% number that I talked about, as vehicles and record numbered of hyper-efficient vehicles, both internal combustion engines and hybrids and others are being offered, consumers are making a pocketbook decision. They're trending towards the vehicles that fit their lifestyle or provide the utility that they need, that are not only safer, but more fuel efficient than what they're replacing. And there's roughly 260 plus million registered vehicles in the US. So at last year's record sales level of 17.5 million, you're only replacing roughly 6 to 7% of vehicles on the roadway. So you have to keep in mind that as important as the policy and the standards are, knowing that vehicles are going to last a while, unless you're actually ensuring that they're affordable for consumers to ensure fleet turnover, you're not actually helping a whole host of things, whether it's environmental, whether it's jobs, whether it's GDP, or whether it's safety. So,
no, that's great. Well, so our history is planting a number of seeds for further discussion here, a rich discussion. Before we move from history to present issues, though, Megan, you we're part of this history as in the Obama White House, and probably with some insight into the California side of things, which we don't have represented here. Do you want to provide a perspective on the developments we've talked about to get to today's date?
Sure.
And I might actually start with a little bit of a Bob Nordhaus tangent, just because that's why we're
Always welcome.
here today. So I was fortunate enough to start my legal career at Van Ness Feldman, where Bob was a partner, and I learned a lot from Bob when I worked with him, as everyone did. But I think objectively, I was not particularly interesting to Bob until I left. And I left and I went to Environmental Defense Fund, and then I was interesting because I was facilitating a set of conversations with lawyers from the private sector, from the nonprofit sector, from academia, trying to figure out how to design the legal foundations of the Clean Power Plan under Section 111D of the Clean Air Act. And then I was really interesting, because then Bob, and this is what he was about, he wanted to wrestle with the most challenging questions of the day in the world of energy and environmental law, and was an incredible addition to those conversations, in part because, as far as Section 111D was concerned, as we were wrestling with what does this language really mean and what can we do, at some point we could turn to Bob and be like, okay, you wrote it, what does it mean? Which he would never answer that question. But it was always very fun to have him there, and we miss him tremendously. So to get back to the transportation standards, I mean, from my perspective, the clean car and truck standards that have been put in place over the last 9 years are among the signature accomplishments in the world of climate for the Obama administration. And I think they get underestimated, in part because they were not a part of the flashy second term, we're doing climate change framework. They started at the very beginning with this incredible moment of opportunity that everyone has discussed. But they were really, really remarkable for a number of reasons. I just want to pause and have everyone think about the fact that you have two different federal agencies with two separate statutory authorities and the state of California trying to work together to get standards that flow from separate statutory authorities, are meeting separate purposes, to at least somewhat align for the sake of like practicality and efficiency, so that the industry can implement them as easily as possible. So if you think about two federal agencies having to work together, that in and of itself should get everyone a little bit of pause. And then you're adding in a state, and then all of this different
And not just any state.
And not just any state,
Yeah.
a state with tremendous expertise in this area, and for that matter, more expertise than the federal government has. It's really incredible, just the fact that they came into existence at all, with extensive engagement of the auto manufacturers. So in terms of innovative policy frameworks, collaboration, and most importantly, results on the ground, I think the clean car and truck standards are just transformative. It was also transformative to go into court in defense of the first round of the clean car standards with the auto manufacturers defending the standards. I mean, that was absolutely remarkable and wonderful. And they are achieving incredible things on the ground. We had all of these years and years of stagnation in terms of the efficiency of the vehicle fleet in this country, suddenly being drastically changed, making significant improvements, and at the same time cutting carbon pollution and conventional air pollutants, saving consumers money at the pump, and then making sure that saved money can be reinvested into the standards have nothing to do with this, but the saved money gets reinvested into the rest of the economy, which becomes a job growth creator. So although this is arguably slightly boring, I think it's worth taking a moment just to look at what EPA did do over the last year in the context of the midterm evaluation process. And perhaps I should say at the beginning of this, there were definitely folks within the administration who did not expect the automakers to be as surprised as they were when the midterm evaluation process concluded. And that was a mistake. In fact, to not realize that was going to come as seen as a very significant disruption was I think a mistake. Any rate, the process, however, of putting together the technical assessment report was this massive effort with lots of experts within the government, lots of outside expertise. I will not go through all 1,200 plus pages of this report, but it gets to some of the issues that Dave was highlighting as really important to make sure that the standards are actually going to work on the ground. So you have this joint assessment report done by California, Department of Transportation, and EPA. EPA, in the context of the final determination, had set itself these criteria for figuring out whether or not the standards are effective, and they include what's happening with the technology, what's going to happen with the technology in terms of when it is going to be needed, lead time for introducing it, costs on producers of the cars, as well as costs on the consumers who are buying the cars, the impact on emissions, oil conservation, et cetera, feasibility and practicality, impacts on the auto industry, impacts on auto safety, as well as this interaction with the CAFE standards themselves. So in the final determination, as based on the foundation of the TAR, the technical assessment report, EPA with NHTSA and California had looked at a range of different compliance scenarios. And these standards are, as Dave mentioned, they're established based on a footprint, so that if at the end of the day you end up selling more of the bigger vehicles, your requirements to actually meet the standards shift accordingly, because otherwise would be very challenging to actually meet the standards. So in the TAR, you have an analysis of all of these different compliance pathways, and the compliance pathways that are looked at in the analysis are primarily looking at the application of technologies that are already in commercial application. There was some noting of the fact that there were innovations that had happened since 2012 that hadn't been expected in 2012, and that costs had been falling with some of those technologies, which was going to make things even easier to achieve. But the conclusion is that the standards could be met largely through advances in the gasoline vehicle technologies without significant penetration of strong hybrids or electric vehicles, but rather improving engines, transmissions, lightweighting, aerodynamics, those sorts of technologies. They looked at different price scenarios, different cost markups, different technology penetrations, and also we're working with the results of a National Academies of Science analysis from 2015. One of the central takeaways of the analysis was that the cost of meeting the standards with the updated information look lower than they had looked when you originally did the projections around the 2012 rule. At that time, EPA projected that the average per vehicle cost of achieving compliance with the standards would be around $1,100. In the TAR, that number was $875. So you have a slight reduction in costs projected. You're going to have less CO2 emissions avoided, potentially, because of the shift to larger vehicles, but still very significant improvements, getting to, as Dave said, around 51 miles per gallon, potentially. With that standard, you're also seeing a reduction in EPA's projections at this point, 540 million metric tons of avoided CO2. That's just the 2022 to 2025 standards, which is what is the subject of the original midterm evaluation. Reducing oil consumption by 1.2 billion barrels. Again, that's just the latter standards. The benefits under the updated analysis are nearly $100 billion. And what was interesting about the benefits is costs of the standards were entirely justified if you looked either at the gas cost savings, the fuel cost savings, or if you looked just at the benefits of the avoided pollution. When you add them up, tremendously beneficial in terms of net impact for society. And then to go back to Dave's, I think, very important point that if consumers will not buy the vehicles, if everyone's just going to keep driving the vehicles that they have, you are not going to have the kind of impact that you need to have. So EPA looked at what was going to happen to the purchasing price and payback periods. So approximately 86% of consumers use financing when they buy a new car. For those folks, they are going to get a payback within a year. For folks who are buying with cash, those lucky people, are going to see payback in about 5 years. And overall, consumers are expected to see net savings of $1,650 over the lifetime of their vehicle. All of this is really, powerful and exciting. What was also powerful and exciting in the analysis was the fact that we've seen overcompliance with the original standards between 2012 and 2015. Including 2015 had the most significant increase in stringency thus far. The increase in efficiency is sort of a gradual process. 2015 was the most significant jump so far. Still are seeing over compliance. As Dave noted, sales have continued to increase, so there doesn't seem to be a massive problem in terms of consumer response to the improvements that are being made. Polling also supports this. Consumers say that they are in support of fuel efficiency standards. It does seem to be one of those areas, behavioral economists could help us with this one, where consumers aren't necessarily naturally going to walk up fuel efficiency on their own through their buying choices, but when you have the interaction of efficiency standards, it does seem to work with the consumer preferences at the end of the day. The final and sort of intriguing paragraph of the midterm evaluation final decision was the administrator noting that she saw enough in the record to potentially justify reopening the record to make the 2022 to 2025 standards more stringent because of what we've seen in terms of the evolution of technologies and emission reduction potential. But that given the fact that you're trying to create this consistent set of standards across the country, and the usefulness of long lead time for manufacturers who are developing new models and getting them out onto the road, that it made more sense to leave the standards the way that they were. So fast forwarding to now, we now have the Trump administration reopening the midterm evaluation. Comment period just closed a couple weeks ago. I'm not going to offer any predictions as to what they may or may not do, as that's not my area of expertise. We also have California opening up a process where they have both reaffirmed their commitment to the 2022 to 2025 standards and are now looking at what can happen going beyond 2025 in terms of where the standards should go from here. And of course, a number of states have adopted the California standards and are interested in continuing to explore what should happen after 2025. I think there remains great interest in having a unified national framework because it makes so much more sense for everyone in terms of making sure that things are working together in an efficient manner. And so I'm very hopeful that we can retain the joint collaborative policy development approach that has, I think, worked quite well over the last few years. But we're going to have to see. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Megan. So I think that sort of brings us to today. We've sort of previewed some of the issues that we're wrestling with today about how to create emission standards and fuel economy standards out into the mid-2020s. To understand that better, we've talked a lot about what we think is happening in the marketplace. Adam, can you tell us a little bit more about what we're seeing in the way of consumption of fuels and consumer preferences and choices of vehicles? Ground us here in what's really happening in the marketplace and how economists look at this going forward.
Kyle, I'd be delighted to do that. And like Megan started off, I'd also like to thank Sarah and Charlie Curtis and Shelley Fiddler and Mrs. Jean Nordhaus, who's come today, for being here to honor Bob. Now, in full disclosure, I think the original invitation for this event said that Jim Connaughton was going to be here. And he spent 8 years as the head of the Council on Environmental Quality. And I'm going to have kind of a hard time competing with that, I think. I did just come off of 4 years as the head of the Energy Information Administration. So I thought that kind of along the lines of that I might be able to look at what some of the EIA's projections are in the 2017 Annual Energy Outlook for the United States. But before I got into that, I actually wanted to kind of go back to Phil's opening remarks and to think about why we had CAFE standards at all. And the primary driving factor, as Phil said, was the 1973 oil embargo, and oil imports were seen as a huge problem, and this was going to be a way to reduce oil consumption. So that makes for an interesting question now, because oil imports on a net basis are getting lower and lower, and under some of the EIA's scenarios, looking out over the next 5 years, 10 years, we might become a net oil exporter. So, how does that drive? Now, I want to go back to first principles, and I found a really interesting study that the Congressional Budget Office did in 2002 that said, here are the 3 policy options for dealing with gasoline and fuels. You could have an excise tax, the gasoline tax. You could have a cap and trade system, or you could have corporate average fuel economy standards. And 99% of economists that were surveyed on this said tax. Now, 99% of Congress are not economists.
This brings us back to the blowtorch.
That was a kind way to put it.
and I haven't heard this one in a while, but there used to be a phrase that was frequently used called third rail politics. Now, all of you know what the third rail is down in the metro system. That's the one that it says, don't touch. And that's the one where there's 440 or 660 volts of power going through it or something like that. And the analogy is, if you touch the gasoline tax, you will die. Right? So we have corporate average fuel economy standards. Now, one of the interesting things is this 2012 switch to the footprint system, and the higher standards, which has some implications. But I want to come back to CAFE in general. It had some interesting results, and economists, have loved to look at these kinds of things, the unintended consequences. One unintended consequence of this tremendous improvement in fuel economy is gasoline demand didn't go up nearly as much as everybody thought, and so we had lower gas tax revenues, so now we can't fix the highways or repair the bridges. And then the second thing that it did was, again, this whole idea of dependence on oil imports and how we're going to fight that, ethanol. So 1 million barrels a day of ethanol being used in gasoline. But again, the combination of the drop in gasoline consumption and this mandate for ethanol to go into gasoline, we've completely fouled up the ethanol rules, and we now have the RIN system, which has refiners pulling their hair out. An interesting unintended consequence. And then there's always Jevons paradox, which I'm not an economist, but I love to read the economic literature. And Jevons paradox says that if you lower the cost of operating something like a car, you might actually increase the demand for that. And so the potential exists as fuel economy standards make it less expensive to drive a car, that you'll actually drive your car more miles and then use more fuel. This is why the economists like the tax idea rather than the others. One of the other, just slightly random observation is, and this was taught to me by Howard Grinspeck, the deputy administrator at EIA for 12 years now, Howard? After you just
Forever.
Longer than that? Was it really longer than that? Howard is now at MIT. A 1 cent per gallon or a dollar tax on carbon dioxide. So if we're going to have a carbon tax, for example, a $1 tax on carbon dioxide is worth about 1 penny on a gallon of gasoline. So you could have a $50 per ton tax on carbon, and that's only 50 cents a gallon. Only 50. I mean, I know it's 50 cents means a lot to a lot of people, but it probably doesn't dramatically change driving habits. But a $50 per ton tax on carbon could make a really, really big difference to what kinds of fuels are used in power generation. So you get into that kind of a question. Okay, the quick quiz, and then I'll just answer it before anybody puts their hand up. The year-to-date, the top 3 selling cars in America are the Ford 150 pickup truck, the Chevy pickup truck, and the Dodge Ram. So that was what David was talking about, is consumer preference is playing a large role in how we're we're dealing with these things. And I'm delighted, actually, that David talked about correlation and these issues. And again, I haven't looked at this, but the increase in fatalities that we've seen over the last 2 years might be more related to the opioid crisis that we're going through than it is to anything that's going on with vehicles. Moving on to what EIA is saying, and I'll just make 5 quick points in the EIA 2017 Annual Energy Outlook. Keep in mind that EIA always does it on the basis of existing law and regulation. We would have to have a continuation of the fuel economy standards after 2025 to change the EIA's numbers. And in fact, if you did that, gasoline consumption in the US might even be lower than what the EIA's forecasts are. But 60% of transportation sector energy consumption in 2016 was gasoline, and in the reference case for EIA, that'll be down to 50% in 2040. There will be growth in distillate fuels because there'll be a lot more trucking because the economy is going to be bigger and more people. Jet fuel consumption is likely to rise as well. One thing you want to keep in mind, if it's oil imports that's the issue that you're trying to deal with, or if it's the carbon dioxide coming from oil consumption, there's oil is used in a lot of different ways than simply in cars and trucks. Transportation energy use in general is expected to decline in the EIA forecast. Efficiency improvements that are already underway lead to lower gasoline consumption. Light duty trucks gain market share. One of the other interesting things to look at is medium and heavy duty truck fuel efficiency standards that could also play a role out to 2040. That could be worth as much as 700,000 or 800,000 barrels a day of oil consumption. Rising penetration of electric vehicles, all of the issues surrounding mobility, autonomous vehicles, ride sharing, and all these things that are, I think, very difficult for anybody to project. One of the things that I find interesting in this issue of how many electric vehicles we're going to sell, which a lot of people are counting on as a way of reducing fuel consumption, is in mobility, what you're looking for is a lot of energy content per unit of volume and weight, right? You don't want to take up all of the volume of the vehicle in the tank, and you don't want the tank to weigh so much that it's a huge factor in the payload. So if you sat around and said, what fuel gives you the best volume and weight, unit volume, like that package, and the answer is diesel fuel and gasoline. So getting consumers to adopt more expensive electric vehicles is not going to be as easy as it was to get consumers to give up horses and adopt the internal combustion, Ford Model T in the mid-teens 100 years ago. Somebody's going to have to come up with a value proposition that really drives people to electric vehicles, and it might be a much better battery. We might see that happen. Or it might be regulations, which is, I think, why we're here having this conversation today. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Before I turn to the audience here to take some questions, one of the things that's come up, Dave, is the issue of, we're thinking about U.S. policy for the most part on this panel, but automakers are truly in a global market, and we're starting to see certainly consumer preferences in some respects, but also policymaker preferences in other countries that could really have an effect on automakers, whether, I think, Phil, you were referring to the the discussion about phasing out internal combustion engines in various European countries, and China with its imperative to address its air quality problem, maybe moving much more rapidly and let's just say forcefully as they can toward electric vehicles or other types of mobility. How, for your members, how does that affect the sort of decisions they make about what they want out of U.S. policy?
Yeah. No, that's a very fair question. I know it kind of builds on some of what Megan pointed to as it relates to not just the California regulation, but the federal regulation. But our member companies are international or global companies, and obviously the policies set here in the United States have a ripple effect, and vice versa. But at the end of the day, you're absolutely right. There are increasing trends as it relates to certain announcements. It's hard to turn on the news or open the paper without seeing some announcement as it relates to increased electrification, which, a lot of our members, if not all, are welcoming. It's not a question if, but when. But then ultimately it comes down to affordability. And right now it ultimately comes back, you're given the 3 biggest selling vehicles. It's interesting, if you were to compare just one of those 3 and then combine all the electric, plug-in electric and hybrid vehicles, those are less than half of one vehicle manufacturer's production of that particular model. So it points back to the acceptance as it relates to affordability.
Well, when we're looking at 2025, 2030, 2040, as I'm sure your members are, they're probably, I'm sure, looking beyond the rather small current penetration to the sort of projections of much larger penetration.
And that's really the tipping point. It's not a question of if, but when. And the problem is, certain assumptions are being made now as it relates to 22 to 25 compliance outside of what actually is occurring. I know Megan pointed to the draft technical assessment report last summer. Let's say a little over 1,000-page document. Anybody want to guess how many were devoted towards consumer acceptance? Less than 2 dozen. So the very underpinnings of whether or not something can be achievable was effectively kind of dismissed and brushed off. So, what's happening around the globe as it relates to countries saying by 2030, 40, 50, we want to phase out the internal combustion engine, that's not all that surprising. And obviously a lot of technological advances would be made from here to now, but that's not 22 to 25, which assumes a degree of adoption which isn't otherwise being realized. And at the end of the day, if consumers are making a decision, and obviously polling tells you one thing, but consumer decisions at the dealership tell you a whole nother one. Oftentimes people will be polled, do you prioritize fuel economy? And people will say, well, yeah, I want the federal government to set important fuel economy standards because that's important to me. But when it comes time to them making a decision, certain analysis might have been built into the draft technical assessment report, but interesting enough, a lot of those paybacks sometimes occur well beyond the average life of a vehicle. It might take you 15 years to get a payback on a vehicle that you're buying tomorrow, but if you're only going to keep it for 5 to 7 years, does it matter? Why are you going to pay that premium for something that you're not going to get a residual benefit for? So a lot of this is interconnected, but yes, it's a global supply chain in terms of what manufacturers are faced with. They like the idea of a one national program, not just domestically, but around the world. But at the same time, you can't compare the US market to the European market, to the Asian market, to developing countries because the disposable income is not the same. The safety mandate and features are not the same. The driving habits are not the same. So the utility does have some cross-application, but it's interrelated. That's helpful.
Kyle, just a couple of quick geopolitical observations. In the short run, with the CAFE standards, there's going to be a really interesting need to coordinate with Canada and Mexico because of the supply chains going across. David said, we don't, his group doesn't do trade. Well, they do now.
Very true.
And a longer term, interesting issue to me is thinking about China. China wanted to dominate wind power, and they did. They wanted to dominate solar cells, and they did. And now they've announced that they want to dominate electric car manufacturing or battery manufacturing, and they might do that too. And I think that has some really interesting implications that kind of ultimately filter back to what we're trying to do in the United States.
Absolutely. Other comments from folks before I turn to the...
I just want to add a few notes as others were talking. This might lead to some broader discussion, but you might find this interesting. There was a comment made as it relates to the EPA decision that was surprising that caught automakers off guard. Well, I was on the call. It was very interesting. It'd be like somebody calling you, telling you you don't have a job, and then convincing you that They were trying to give you that guidance today because it was better for you to know you didn't have a job today than you didn't in the future. But in the context of that conversation, and then also something that Megan said, she said, well, it was also premised on the fact that automakers were over-complying. Well, that actually is not the case. NHTSA came out with its projected numbers in February that showed compliance, and it was actually the opposite. That was one of the things that the previous administration, kind of relied upon, is that, as you can imagine, a manufacturer is going to produce a vehicle over, say, 5 to 8 years. It's generally a bell curve. You kind of over-comply on the front end, and you over-comply on the back end, and the average of the two, based on your credits, is going to result in compliance. Well, the challenge as it relates to what's happening is that we're not even at compliance, at least projected under NHTSA, before we get to 22 to 25. And it's not because manufacturers aren't making progress as it relates to efficiencies. It's that consumers are making decisions that are changing the equation as it relates to whether or not they're in compliance. So I just want to make clear, the previous administration said, for purposes of the midterm review, 22 to 25, we're going to lock in those greenhouse gas numbers because automakers have overcomplied in the past, therefore they're going to overcomply in the future. It's not the case. That has to do with something that's known as harmonization. It was one of the two underpinnings as it relates to one national program. One, that there be one single national standard. You'll find this interesting, not necessarily the genius of the CAFE program, but the CAFE program overlaid with the greenhouse gas program, which was not statutorily directed when it comes to automobiles, creates a dynamic today where an automaker can be in compliance with a more stringent EPA standard, but have to pay fines on the CAFE side because the statute hasn't been updated to keep into account the agreement back in 2009, 2011. So it's very interesting. Manufacturers today, before we even get to 22 to 25, are having challenges relating to the fact that they haven't witnessed the promised benefits when it comes to one national program for program harmonization between the feds and California. And then on top of that, there was one other thing I wanted to point out. Some of the things that were built into the draft technical assessment report. One, the midterm review is not over. It can't be over. The midterm review was premised on two actions. One, greenhouse gases, and a NHTSA NPRM for 22 to 25. We haven't even had a notice proposed rulemaking from NHTSA. So I don't know how on earth the midterm review can be over if the one entity that's responsible for creating fuel economy standards hasn't even initiated the process. And once they do, they don't necessarily pick a number out of thin air. They provide a range of alternatives that ultimately have to be based on max feasible. And if folks were to walk away with one thing from some of the things that certainly I've said, but that we've all touched on, we're in agreement. We want continuation. We want a continuation of one national program. It's in the benefit of manufacturers, and it's ultimately in the benefit of consumers to have an agreed upon standard, because otherwise a fractured system doesn't help anybody. And in fact, I would say, and I'm not speaking for California here, but there's been certain public statements that California has made, the governor on down, that stipulate that if the current administration deviates 1/10 of an MPG different from what was in the final determination, they'll effectively exercise their waiver, and that will bring potentially 13 other states with them, and we'll have a fractured system. But you've got to remember, it's not just 13 states. An automaker is then regulated individually within each one of those states based on the composition of sales in those states. So it's not 13 states as one standard and the federal government as the other. It's really 13 individual states plus a federal standard, which creates an even worse environment. So the thing that I want folks to walk away with is an understanding that, one, we want preservation of one national program. Two, in February, 19 CEOs of automakers sent a letter to the president saying, we believe the midterm needs to get put back on track from the standpoint that it was effectively hijacked from what everybody agreed to. Secondly, we're for increased regulation in terms of fuel economy standards. We're okay with that, but if it doesn't take into account what's actually happening, we're actually doing the opposite of what's important when it comes to a host of national priorities, whether it's the environmental agenda as it relates to safety and the like. So I want folks to walk away that, one, automakers aren't sitting back because the Trump administration got elected saying that, we need to have this full stop and we need to go in the opposite direction. We've actually asked for increased regulation, but if it's not based in reality, it doesn't do anybody good. It doesn't do the consumer any good. It certainly doesn't do the U.S. Domestic manufacturers any good. It doesn't do anything for trade and the balance.
Okay. That's helpful. Well, let's bring the audience
Kyle,
into this
can I
discussion.
just jump in on
Yeah,
just
Megan, go ahead.
one
You may.
aspect of that, because I think Dave is raising a really important point, which is that the midterm review process does involve both of those agencies. So what was completed was EPA's process on the greenhouse gas standards, which are put in place under the Clean Air Act. And in that context, what EPA was looking at in terms of overcompliance for the early years was overcompliance with the EPA standards. And we actually heard a lot about how The NHTSA framework, because it didn't have built in some of the flexibilities that the EPA framework was able to develop, you had automakers, I think, planning to meet the EPA standards and assuming they'd be in compliance with NHTSA, only to find out that there was actually, because NHTSA simply has statutory constraints on the way that it can provide flexibility, they were going to be fine with EPA, but having some challenges with NHTSA. And so all of those questions in terms of NHTSA's feasibility, NHTSA has to go through an entire rulemaking process to develop their later year standards because of the 5-year limit. And so those processes still have to be adjusted. What EPA was looking at was simply for EPA's own 2022 to 2025 standards within their statutory constructs, which is different, and there are limits to how much harmonization you can have because of those different statutory authorities. They had found that it was feasible, considering all of the differences in what had happened with technology and looking at different pathways that automakers could take, including, I think, by the very function of the design of the standards, consumer preference, because you have the footprint design and that moves what your obligations are based on what people are buying.
But really quick, this is critical. So true, midterm review, obviously it was comprised of 2 agency actions plus California. But remember, midterm review was supposed to be about harmonizing the programs and ensuring, remember the timeline that I talked about that came down from EPA's website that talked about how everybody was going to coordinate between NHTSA and EPA? That assumed that they were going to make one decision. When EPA in January, right before the inauguration, a week before the president was inaugurated, made their final determination on greenhouse gases, that effectively sent a signal that they were locking in the 22 to 25 greenhouse gas standards, which are not one and the same with CAFE standards. And this is terribly important. So one, you had an agreement that was based on making a unified decision that has now been bifurcated. And then on top of it, this is important, under the Clean Air Act, there's actually only 2 means of compliance for greenhouse gases. One, you can pay a penalty, or excuse me, you either have to comply or you have to buy credits, okay? So that's on the greenhouse gas side, not statutory, but under the greenhouse gas process. On the CAFE side, you can do 3 things for compliance. You can meet the standard, which traditional US domestic manufacturers do. You can use credits, basically something that you over-complied with in the past, you can carry it forward to an extent. Or 3, you can pay a penalty. There is no means of compliance for a manufacturer to pay a penalty if you're out of whack with the greenhouse gas standard. So if the EPA set the greenhouse gas standard here, but NHTSA's number is actually here, there's no way for you to bridge this divide unless you have credits, because there is no way to pay a penalty. So this is a tremendously important point. You could create a dynamic where manufacturers effectively can't deploy vehicles because they don't comply, even though that's what the consumer wants to buy. And that was really an underpinning, going back to the CAFE statute back in the 70s, is that Congress has been very careful that they do not want to make decisions for consumers in terms of consumer choice. That's why it's an average. That's why the footprint-based standards built in that flexibility. So at the end of the day, to say that EPA wanted to go higher, and California certainly wanted them to go higher, but they just stuck with the agreement back from 2012, that's fair. But unless you resolve the NHTSA side, which has a statutory requirement to look at a host of factors, including practicability and economic impact and safety, unless you align those two, you're basically creating a nightmare.
Well, I'm tempted to say that the remarkable deal that brought California, 2 federal agencies, and the automakers together at the table was only missing all of Congress, for which we can blame Phil for leaving the Congress to create the law that was necessary to actually harmonize those 2 programs.
Well, just think what Congress could do now. It could actually straighten this all out,
Yeah.
make it all clear, and we could have a very clear set of rules and regulations. You just have to have more confidence.
Yeah. Well,
I don't, by the way.
I'm sure that Phil, Megan, and I could sit in a room and we could probably hash this out.
That would be very good. So I will now bring the audience into this discussion. If you have a question, I will call on you. Please, I would ask, first of all, have a question, and also, please say your name and your affiliation for the benefit of those in the room in the panel. Sarah gets a prerogative here.
Great, thank you so much. This was such an interesting panel, and I learned things I forgot, and it was wonderful. So a couple questions. One is, there seem to be 2 things that have driven vehicle efficiency standards in the past. One is this need to corral all the hydra, the various heads that can get ahead of another head, and you've got to kind of, harmonize them. So in some ways, that seems to be a very productive dynamic for making sure that we continue to increase vehicle efficiency standards. And so I wonder if anyone has an opinion on whether or not the California threat to depart this grand bargain is precisely what's needed to actually make sure you don't get a least common denominator solution. So I'm going to put that out. I know it's kind of a controversial way to put that question forward. The second one is that we seem to have predicated a lot of the history of this policy on energy security, which I guess arguably this administration doesn't seem to be so worried about energy security, since we want to energy dominate folks. But more that you see more analysis that the justification for this is on climate grounds. And so given that sort of we're not worried about energy security and the federal government doesn't seem to be terribly worried about climate change right now, does that really just take out the bottom underneath this wanting to do more on vehicle efficiency standards, a la the agreement of the last administration?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so two questions there. One about essentially the role of California. Is it a necessary hammer that keeps this moving? And then a question about whether the thematic change from energy security to energy dominance implies some different foundation or policy.
Well, yeah, let me just answer in a second. I don't think there's any question in my mind that the energy security issue doesn't exist in the same frame at all. And you could not justify this kind of intervention into our oil market and our manufacturing market on the basis of national oil security. That's a holdover from the 70s, in which we probably were off base then. But the point is that from a standpoint of the climate, which in my view is the biggest, hardest thing in which we and the rest of the world are having trouble formulating serious policy on, the transportation sector must continue to improve, but let's not kid ourselves. Fuel efficiency is only one. Dave referred and others have referred to. There are a whole series of other things in transportation, including getting out here on your bicycle, that are relevant to doing this, and you cannot build a policy on transportation only on fuel efficiency. That's another naive kind of direction. I don't mean to say it's not important, but I really think we ought to get out of this almost silly view in my mind that energy security is even a part of this debate on fuel economy.
With respect to Congress, one of the things to keep in mind, I mean, despite what may or may not happen under this agreement, effectively the statute's there. So there's always the backstop. Secondly, there's a self-checking mechanism as it relates to California. So, that's probably not going away. But one of the interesting observations I've had in terms of looking at not only what's happening here in Washington among federal agencies, but then also with California, is that, remember, we're talking about the midterm review for 22 to 25, but what's really guiding California has nothing to do with 22 to 25. It's looking beyond, because California has its own laws and executive orders as it relates to regulation of greenhouse gases, climate change, and the like. So California is kind of operating within the short-term environment. Our members right now are being asked to go to California to sit down with CARB to talk about 2030 compliance. So that's very interesting that California is asking our members to talk about 2030 and beyond compliance, when we're saying, wait a minute here, we've got some problems right now, and you can't get ahead of existing compliance to project what future compliance is. We still want to go up in terms of stringency, but if it's not properly sized. So, I would say there's probably more agreement than not, but I'd say larger optics related to other geopolitical and environmental issues are consuming this issue and this industry, our members, as it relates to getting to a resolution. But the observation was made earlier that everything that evolved through this process after the Bush administration into the Obama administration, after the Supreme Court case, this all happened outside of Congress. Partly due to the dynamic as it relates to the Democrat majority. There wasn't effectively buy-in, but now Congress is kind of saying, wait a minute here, there was a joint final rule that had a midterm review, and now things are kind of going sideways. Maybe we need to have a role in this process. So I think that at the end of the day, we hope that that agreement can be reached. Just to give folks a timeline, right now we're obviously in 2017. Comments were just taken on the midterm review. The next likely action would be some type of action by the Department of Transportation proposing something as it relates to the notice of proposed rulemaking for fuel economy standards. And then it's going to be some time until that is ultimately finalized. So, as far as California is concerned, there's really nothing to shoot at until such time as something is finalized, because right now we're in kind of this limbo period. But remember, automakers are saying, wait a minute here, we've got compliance problems and harmonization between the two programs that was promised and hasn't been realized, and it can either be effectuated through the administration or through Congress. But we need to get that right before we can even think through 22 to 25. And the sooner we have this clarity, the sooner we can make the planning decisions. I mean, vehicle plants don't just get built overnight, and you don't just design a hyper-efficient vehicle. I mean, it was interesting, I don't know if folks have witnessed this, and I'll close with this, is that in some of the modeling that EPA did in their draft technical assessment report, we can't replicate it. In some instances, it shows the aerodynamics of a minivan having to equal the aerodynamics of a sports car. So, I mean, it gets back to the fact that we believe there's fundamental flaws, not only through EIA numbers as it relates to oil prices, where they were originally projected to where they are today, roughly a 38% drop. Yes, I'm not saying that technology costs haven't also come down to some degree, but you've got to take into account, projections in the past aren't necessarily as valid today. And if we don't right-size things, and that's what's kind of perplexing to us, is the previous administration actually prided itself on the fact that this was a very innovative regulatory joint final rule. It had a reopener, and the head of OIRA in the past has actually pointed back, Office of Information Regulatory Affairs at Office of Management and Budget, for those who don't know OIRA, but they're effectively the budgetary regulatory arm of the administration. And they've made clear that this joint final rule with a reopener is actually the way that all federal regulations should be done, because it ensures that there's at least a relief valve to ensure that something that they projected can be updated accordingly. And then what do we have here? We have an OIRA process that was bypassed for the final determination to be made. They didn't do an economic analysis as it relates to a joint final rule that was solidified in 2011. So at the end of the day, unless you've got that built-in mechanism to ensure that it's based on transparency and the most relevant data, you're going to have a broken process. So, is CAFE as apparent today as it was back in the 70s? Probably not, but now it's far more complicated. And the thing that I haven't talked about is a whole nother California waiver called zero-emission vehicles. So CAFE is regulated based on what consumers buy, but the zero-emission vehicles, followed under another waiver with 10 other states, actually mandates the sale of zero-emission vehicles, which are basically plug-in electrics, at 15% of the market by 2025. And there is no way to pay your way out of that one.
Right.
If I could just quickly, I made a flippant remark about Congress could harmonize and solve this, and there's no question they could legally, but I don't think any of us seriously, it's not about this Congress or any other
Under
Congress.
the Constitution.
I would not want to go through that process, all right? And I think the automakers probably don't want to go through that, and the environmentalists don't want to go through that. But I think it is really important to recognize the high-skilled political leadership that led to the grand bargain in 2011. This is very unusual. It was extremely difficult. Bob Nordhaus was working on it, and he had called a bunch of us, and he was working with Megan, he was working with all kinds of people to say, there ought to be a solution to this, and he was trying to look at intellectually how to do it. So it was just another place where Bob was right in there, providing some foundational information and ideas, and always curious. But the real thing to look at here is we talk about how unsuccessful our political system is. There's so many problems with it. But this is a real achievement. And the administration, the auto people, the environmentalists, the state of California, they all ended up saying, we've got to find some pathway here. And they did. And if you'd asked most of us that have been involved in these issues, we would have predicted, they won't make it. But they did.
Can I just say briefly,
Yeah,
I agree on California 100%, and which is why I think that maybe the three-headed monster analogy is actually a little optimistic, because in that case, it's all the same body.
Right.
And I think we're going to test that proposition here, so we'll see.
We had a question over here. Yes, Reed.
Reed Dutchin with the United Nations Foundation. Thinking about the title of this conference, and at the risk of suggesting collaboration with another agency, one phrase that hasn't come up today is Department of Energy. As it happens, the department has, for the past several years, had an exercise to determine what the best combination of fuel and vehicle would be to achieve the goals that we're talking about here in terms of efficiency and greenhouse gas emissions reductions. Even as we think about electrifying the fleet, and I'm super supportive of that, I think the point we heard earlier is that fleet life alone is going to guarantee that we're going to have internal combustion engines on the road for a long time. But the EPA original rule and the guidance on the midterm evaluation omitted fuels from consideration, despite comments by many that they should be considered. So what I'm wondering, with the potential of high octane, low carbon fuels to enable automakers to make more efficient vehicles and to achieve greenhouse gas reductions, is the midterm evaluation reopener an opportunity to re-raise that issue, bring the Department of Energy expertise into the process, and get a better outcome?
No, that's a great multi-layered question. I'd maybe take a stab at it, and I know others maybe want to jump into it. So interestingly enough, I know Megan had pointed out that the comment period on midterm review recently closed. Actually, one of the questions that was raised from EPA related to whether or not octane could assist as it relates to some of the efficiencies. You know, going back to previous work with the previous administration on the EPA side, it was interesting as they were kind of winding down in the last couple of years when automakers would go and try to talk as it relates to the potential efficiencies that could be gained from octane. So this isn't just about, you know, ethanol blends or something like that. It's just octane generally. They said that they didn't have time for that. They were just landing planes. They didn't have time to have planes take off. And I think that's one of the challenges. Yes, both EPA and NHTSA, to differing degrees, incorporate some thought from DOE and the labs as it relates to some of those improvements. But it would take multiple years and or other stakeholders in the energy sector, particularly refiners, to try to crack that nut. But yes, the short answer is there would be some potential benefit as it relates to potential octane improvements that could have an impact on fuel economy, but it would also add, I guess, another headed monster to the three-headed beast. And I think time probably isn't on everybody's side. I don't know what it would take lead time-wise to try to implement some of those things, but if we're worried about 22 to 25 compliance, you might not be able to witness from a supply chain refining standpoint some of those improvements until the latter end of that period.
This also,
2025 would be useful to the automakers.
I think that's fair.
this also goes to a separate part of this whole thing. For years, the federal government, state of California, the industry have put money into research on technology, all kinds of things. And some of this is on the chopping block this very year in the budget, and people have to make up their minds how serious is it that we transform this sector, and what legitimate role, it's not that all government research is good, that does, but that's a supplemental part of this. My view is this, the ZEV mandate, which never could be fully enforced, always drove the industry up the wall and to new technology, including hybrids, but go ahead.
Let me take one more question back in the back there.
David, in going through the chronology and complaining about the Obama administration.
Say your name and.
Oh, I'm sorry, Kevin Vincent with Faraday Future. Complaining about the Obama administration's cutting short of the grand bargains process and midterm evaluation, you left out, you didn't mention the letter the alliance wrote the day after the election to President Trump. And I wondered if either you or Megan wanted to comment on what impact, if any, that may have had on EPA's reaction and what they ended up doing.
No, that's fair. He's referring to a letter that the Alliance sent. It was something that we'd actually drafted, not knowing the outcome of the election that was going to go to either Clinton or Trump. So in all fairness, that letter would have been transmitted either way. But it was just laying out a host of concerns as it relates to the process by which the midterm was kind of being shortchanged in terms of the comment period and the like. So I've heard this speculation or comment that some have made that somehow that precipitated EPA wanting to press ahead. But at the end of the day, I know Megan started her comments talking about how, you know, there's no question that from an Obama administration, particularly the first term, this is probably, I would say, probably the largest environmental achievement in terms of a policy objective. So at the end of the day, you know, the cross pressures of the administration after the election wanting to, carry things through to the finish line, and/or the cross pressures from California Air Resources Board and the governor, I suspected, resulted in that determination of wanting to solidify the proposed determination, final determination, before a new administration took place. Keep in mind, when they finalized that determination, it was never inserted in the Federal Register. They claimed it was an adjudicatory action, and it didn't otherwise require publication in the Federal Register. So here you have something that's impacting a broad cross-section of the nation that otherwise was basically written off as, oh, well, everything we looked at was justified based on what we evaluated back in 2011, therefore we're pressing forward. So the letter that you're referring to, I don't believe in any sense actually triggered the proposed final determination. I think that was the plan all along. It just got sped up. You don't want to touch that one?
No comment.
Okay. Well, please join me in thanking the panelists here. I found that a fascinating discussion.
Took so much time at the
beginning. The war in Syria represents a new low for the international community. We're seeing a war without law, as well as seemingly a war without end. It's very, very striking that we're living in an age of the bombing of UN convoys, never mind the targeting of hospitals.
So we were so surprised and shocked when we saw our colleagues covered with their blood and giving their last breaths. I don't know how to describe that. It's so hard emotionally. It's like you are losing one of your precious in front of your eyes.
We're witnessing a profound surge of violence against civilians, against health workers, patients, facilities, humanitarian convoys across a full spectrum of countries that is really shredding the accountability and protections that are contained in the Geneva Conventions.
The attack on Kunduz was a sustained attack over an hour, despite the fact that all the parties knew us, had our GPS coordinate. We must say that it was our biggest loss in terms of lives. 42 people died, 14 of our staff.
This was a tragic mistake.
This is a period when there's the danger of vacuum around the world and a danger for the abuse of power by states that are strong enough to do so. The international sense of conscience and consciousness that led to the responsibility to protect in the early 2000s has certainly been eroded.
People are struggling to respond. They're building clinics and hospitals in underground bunkers. They're documenting these attacks and publishing them. They're taking measures to the UN Security Council.
Stop bombing hospital, stop bombing health workers.
But up to now, these measures have not had much effect in deterring attacks. But many courageous individuals and groups continue the fight. This is a fight that's going to last well into the future.
We believe that war stopped at the door of our hospital, and we want to preserve that. And we want to preserve access to health care in war zones. That's a battle that's worth to fight.
Space is a critical enabler for military operations and an increasingly important domain of modern warfare. But operating in space is expensive. What would it mean for the U.S. military if costs were reduced significantly?
Start 1-0.
Disruptive breakthroughs that could significantly reduce the cost of access to space may come in many forms. One of the most pursued methods for reducing the cost of access to space is making launch vehicles less expensive. Building launch vehicles in much greater quantities can enable efficiencies in the manufacturing process. but quantity alone is unlikely to yield order of magnitude reductions in costs. Novel forms of propulsion could also one day reduce costs.
But perhaps the most promising disruption is reusability. If a launch vehicle can be reused 10 times with minimal maintenance between flights, it could, in theory, reduce the effective vehicle cost by roughly an order of magnitude. Repairing or reusing satellites in space through on-orbit servicing could also reduce the cost of access to space. Instead of launching a 5,000-kilogram satellite to field a new space capability, one could launch a 500-kilogram payload to upgrade an existing satellite.
A significant reduction in the cost of access to space could enable new military space missions that are not feasible at current costs. Placing conventional weapons in orbit to strike targets on Earth has been explored in the past. One limitation has been the cost of launching the large number of satellites that would be needed to have a similar capability as a fleet of ground-based long-range missiles. An even larger constellation of satellites would be needed for a boost-phase kinetic missile interceptor system. Because the kill vehicle required for a missile intercept is more technologically complex, launch costs are a smaller share of the total cost. A space-based missile interceptor system could also be adapted to strike an adversary's satellites or to defend against anti-satellite missiles launched at friendly satellites.
Lower launch costs could also enable space transportation and logistics for critical military operations. A crewed vehicle system similar to what commercial firms are developing for space tourism could be adapted by the military to deliver small numbers of special operations forces or critical supplies to virtually any location on Earth within 30 to 45 minutes. Many of the disruptions that could reduce the cost of access to space and enable new missions, architectures, and operations for the U.S. military could also provide the same advantages to potential adversaries. Other nations could be incentivized to field space-based systems for ground attack, missile defense, and anti-satellite missions, whether or not the United States pursues such systems. A significant reduction in the cost of launch vehicles in particular could mean a reduction in the cost of long-range missiles, potentially leading to a rapid and uncontrolled proliferation.
Significant cost reductions are not likely until space launch becomes more of a commercial rather than a government activity. But the government has a big role to play. The government can seed key market areas by paying for and sharing risky early R&D on disruptive technologies, and helping commercial companies develop common standards so that a competitive commercial ecosystem emerges. The government can help commercial space grow by purchasing more services rather than using only its own version of these capabilities. Government can be the anchor customer for many of the emerging disruptive commercial technologies on the horizon. Also, the government can make getting to space easier by simplifying government approvals and striking a careful balance to maintain the United States' lead in commercial space while protecting national security.
The emergence of a robust commercial space market and the promise and peril it offers will take time to fully develop, but the nation that shapes this future is likely to benefit the most.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Hit-to-kill ballistic missile defense is the ultimate precision guidance challenge. Many elements of defense must come together to achieve a long-range intercept. One of the most important and difficult parts is known as mid-course discrimination. After a ballistic missile launches, its engines burn hot and can be detected by infrared satellites. Outside the Earth's atmosphere, the missile engines burn out and it reaches its peak velocity. At this point, the missile's payload, a warhead, usually separates from the rest of the body. The warhead is also accompanied by the flying junk pile of debris created by launching a missile, as well as by decoys or other countermeasures designed to complicate the missile defense job. All of these objects move together through space as part of a threat cloud. So for a missile defense system to successfully destroy the warhead, its various sensors must first discriminate it from among the various other parts of the cloud. The key to successful discrimination is the sensor architecture. Sea and land-based radars provide one picture of the threat cloud. Lower frequency radars are able to track the threat cloud, but have trouble distinguishing within it. Once cued, higher frequency or X-band radars provide much sharper images of the objects within the cloud. But radars are limited by their vantage point and by their technology. Multiple phenomenologies can provide a more complete rendering and classification. Air or space-based sensors provide still other perspectives with greater persistence, potentially allowing for birth-to-death tracking. And infrared sensors show not just objects but their heat signature, especially low-orbit satellites looking sideways, comparing the objects against the coldness of space. Currently, U.S. homeland missile defense is dependent upon only terrestrial radars. This places a large burden on the sensor network and makes it harder to identify the objects. That in turn means that the defender has to engage more of the objects in the cloud so as not to miss the warhead, either by firing more interceptors or multiple kill vehicles atop a single one. After the interceptors are launched, they receive imagery of the threat cloud, which algorithms compare to a threat database to help pick which objects should be engaged. All this is fused with the kill vehicle's own observations using onboard sensors to make the final determination for intercept. Finally, they maneuver into position to collide with the several targets that could be a warhead. The discrimination challenge is hard, but not insurmountable. An efficient and robust discrimination system should include a mix of sensors with different technologies from different domains on land, sea, air, and space.
While much of the world focuses on terrorism in the Middle East, violent extremist groups have expanded their ambitions and reach in Africa as well. In the Western Sahel, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb has produced or inspired a proliferation of extremist groups that continue to destabilize the region. In the areas around Lake Chad, Boko Haram, with its origins in northeast Nigeria, has left tens of thousands of civilians dead and displaced almost 3 million people. The security vacuum in Libya and the presence of Islamic State and Al-Qaeda deepen the risks to the Sahel region.
There has been a lot of turmoil and trouble with these radical elements, which you find in this arc of instability from North Africa to Afghanistan.
Military intervention by regional forces, France, and the UN have weakened these groups and reclaimed territories they once held. But the drivers of militancy and the complex social, economic, and political environment that fuels these groups remain very much intact. Unless this understructure of vulnerability and criminality is addressed, extremist violence will remain an enduring threat to the region.
January 17, Iraq time, marks an unrecognized milestone. The United States has been bombing that country almost continuously for a quarter of a century. What has the U.S. been trying to accomplish with all these air attacks? And what has been the effect? The air attacks have occurred in 5 phases. But to fully understand this history, we need to go back to the beginning of air power theory. The tactical use of air power sought to defeat enemy air attacks and to strike enemy ground forces. But the horror of World War I led some air power advocates to propose a new idea: use air power strategically to strike at an enemy's economy, population, and political leadership, thereby winning wars without costly ground campaigns. The massive conventional air campaigns in World War II, in Korea, and in Vietnam produced many positive results, but they did not by themselves produce enemy surrender. When Desert Storm began, some in the Air Force hoped that new technologies would force Saddam to surrender from an air campaign alone. Others saw air power as part of a joint campaign working with ground and naval forces.
An attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait.
Air attacks did make a major contribution to winning Desert Storm. But as was true of previous adversaries, Saddam did not surrender to air attacks alone. Iraqi civil society and Saddam's government proved to be highly resilient. After the war, Saddam used his own air power to suppress insurrections and stay in power. So the U.S. instituted no-fly zones in the north to protect the Kurds and in the south to protect the Shia. These were successful in protecting the threatened groups, but no-fly zones turned out to be major military operations. Maintaining them year after year required continuous suppression of Iraqi air defenses and periodic attacks on the Iraqi military.
I take the fact that he develops weapons of mass destruction.
The U.S. launched a new wave of air attacks during the invasion of Iraq in 2003. These attacks looked a lot like those of 1991, with two changes. The first was attacking Iraqi leadership directly, called decapitation. The second was called shock and awe, hitting a society so hard and in so many ways that it becomes disoriented and collapses. Both failed. Saddam evaded attack, and although Iraqi society suffered, Saddam did not surrender. In other areas, air power again made major contributions. During the long Iraqi insurgency, air power played a useful but secondary role because insurgencies produced only a few and then very fleeting targets. Many air missions were taken over by UAVs. Their patience and precision matched the nature of counterinsurgency. Over the years, a conventional wisdom has arisen about the use of air power. Decapitation is hard to do, but can sometimes be successful if there is a small group of charismatic enemy leaders.
Get started again. Yeah, I'm on. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody, and to Kyle and the panel for a really excellent discussion on vehicle efficiency standards. I thought it was really helpful both in outlining the history of the regulation and the policy approaches, but also the competitiveness imperative facing the transportation sector. We're going to switch gears a little bit here now and talk about all the things happening in the electric power sector. We are not going to go through in quite as much detail the history of all of the regulation and law underpinning all of the electric power sector, because I think that takes a month, and we don't have that much time. But we will go through some of the issues that are facing and, quite frankly, reshaping the electric power sector throughout the U.S. right now, both the regulatory and policy issues and the market and technology issues as well. This is something we've dedicated the last several years to here at CSIS, building up a program where we understand those things better and can dedicate ourselves to having a good public policy and public education conversation around those issues. To do this, I am really thrilled and sort of embarrassed at the abundance of riches that we've got on this panel today. We've got a number of people to talk about this from various perspectives. First, we've got to my immediate left, I'm going to try and get the direction here right, the former chairman of FERC, Joe Kelleher, who is now the executive vice president, NextEra Energy. And then right next to him, Tony Clark, who is also a former FERC commissioner and now a senior advisor at Wilkinson, Barker, and Nauer. I read this so that I get the law firm names right. And then we've got Emily Fischer, who's vice president and legal and corporate secretary at the Edison Electric Institute. And then we've got Michelle Patron, who's the director of sustainability policy at Microsoft and a former official at the Obama administration White House, and also a longtime friend of a lot of folks in the energy program. And then finally, we've got Doug Smith, who's a partner at Van Ness Feldman, and thank you again for all of your help putting together today's event and panel. So to start out with, as I said, there are just such a numerous amount of forces that are reshaping the electric power industry today. And because we're talking about the past, present, and future of the sector, I wanted to start with Chairman Kelleher and talk a little bit about the period of time that you were at FERC. the changes that you oversaw while you were there, and you've been involved in electric power policymaking for a long time, and maybe a little bit about how that sort of led to what we're seeing today. So if we could start with you.
Sure, thanks. So I feel like I'm the ghost of Christmas past on some of these issues. He was the really scary one. I always sort of liked him. Let me start with competition policy. I was chairman at a time when actually both wholesale power and gas prices were very high. The day I became chairman, I think the price of natural gas was $9, and it hit $15 a month later during Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. So I was chairman during a period of high prices, and I was chairman a few years after the California crisis, but there were still a lot of after effects of the political after effects of the California crisis. So there was some effort by consumers to try to flip between the lower of cost or market in that dynamic. When market prices are high because of fundamental drivers like high natural gas prices, consumers wanted to find the safe haven of, well, let's leave markets and let's get a cost of service price in lieu of a market price. Let's elect between the two. FERC really held the line on that thing just for the obvious reason that a market can survive if buyers can flip between the lower of cost or market, or sellers can flip between the higher of cost or market. It just can't work that way. So FERC really held the line and shrugged off a lot of political pressure to that end. And there was a lot. I mean, I always think of one of the worst filings I ever got when I was chairman was a filing. It was a 206 petition. It essentially had one paragraph of argument, and then it had 13 pages of signatures, each of which had, say, 20 signatures on every page. So they had 260 signatures or something. And we rejected it really quickly, like the day after the comment period. And the author of it was apoplectic, saying, how could you reject that filing? And I thought, look, you should know better that 260 signatures from groups like the Isaac Walton League of Hartford, Connecticut, those noted, electricity market experts, just one paragraph argument and 260 signatures is not a strong petition at FERC. It might be a strong petition at other agencies. If you had 13 pages of argument and one signature, you would have been better off. But that I think really spoke to FERC. Today, though, of course, we're dealing with the crisis of low prices, not high prices. And we see a really determined effort by sellers to be able to choose between the higher of cost or market. And some are seeking the safe haven of cost-based regulation during the period when market prices are low. Presumably, they will want to flip back out to market prices when that trend reverses. You're seeing attacks on markets like there were attacks on markets during a period of high prices. It's a pretty emotional and political environment. And it's interesting and surprising to me that there seems to be more political pressure on FERC to allow buyers to choose between the higher of cost or market than there was on FERC from consumers to allow consumers to choose the lower of cost or market. But FERC shrugged off political pressure in the past. I remember on one issue, the MRTU, the Market Redesign and Transmission Upgrade, for you Cal ISO junkies. FERC at that point, there were 11 governors pressuring FERC to reject the filing, not because it frankly was hostile to their states, but it was positive for California. And FERC shrugged off that opposition, approved it, and the political pressure disappeared. The structure of competitive markets is a little bit different. We've seen some retreat by hybrid companies. NextEra Energy is a hybrid company. We have a vertically integrated utility as well as a competitive company. But other companies, there's fewer of us in the market than there used to be. Demand growth is much lower than it used to be. I remember working on the infamous Cheney Task Force report. And it was speculated, it had some metric that I'd probably be embarrassed to look at now, like how many power plants a week had to be built for the US to have enough electricity supply, and we were wildly off, at least looking at current growth. When I was chairman, because gas prices were high, that's when the nuclear renaissance occurred, or at least the plant orders occurred, and that has panned out differently. Infrastructure development's a little bit different. When I was at FERC, gas pipeline siting was actually not controversial. The only political pressure we got was from, sometimes we'd get occasional letters from senators saying go faster, approve it faster. So Tony's experience was very different than mine. FERC was extremely efficient on gas pipeline siting when I was there. It would routinely take 2 years or less. When I was chairman, we approved 7,000 miles of pipeline. It's much more contentious now, and it takes much longer now. It actually takes about a year longer than it used to. And that is frustrating to people developing gas pipelines. But FERC works really hard at it. It's just there's much more pressure. There are much more organized efforts at the state level to deny necessary permits. When I was chairman, there was a fear that North America was running out of natural gas. The Canadian imports dropped 2 years in a row, and that caused a crisis because the U.S. knew our gas production was declining, and that was God's will that U.S. gas production decline. But you could always count on Canada to make up the shortfall. But when Canadian imports dropped 2 years in a row, it caused a crisis, and the worry was, are we approving LNG import terminals fast enough? And I never could have conceived of the shale gas revolution. It's amazing. There was federal-state tension then, and guess what? There's still federal-state tension. And in the area of electric regulation, it really doesn't exist in the area of gas regulation because there's jurisdictional lines match up more neatly with industry structure. So in gas, no one regulates producers, at least economically. FERC regulates pipelines, states regulate LDCs. You're not regulating the same activity by the same companies. In electric, you're regulating sales. Wholesale and retail differences are sort of a fiction, but I shouldn't say that. They're legally distinct, but an economist wouldn't recognize them as totally separate things. So you're both regulating sales of electricity by vertically integrated entities, and you're regulating transmission. You're both regulating transmission. So there's just always going to be some level of tension. I think FERC historically, before me and after me, has really been committed to merits-based decision-making and independent regulation. And I think things will work out well as long as FERC continues to do those things. So with that, thanks for inviting me. I look forward to the questions.
Great, thank you. No, it's really, it's amazing to think about how you were chairman not so super long ago.
It feels like a long ago when you go through the differences though, right?
And then some of
$15 gas.
Well, it's really amazing, right? I mean, we talk about it all the time from sort of a broad production standpoint, and people say, oh yes, we're producing more, and everyone sort of knows that, but the psychology of that environment as compared to the one today is really profound. And as we talked about on the last panel, that energy security mantra that was so pervasive and fluctuated with prices, it really does affect a huge part of the political economy of these sorts of things. I want to pick up on something you said and use it to prompt Commissioner Clark-Tony to say some things, but you said, we're in this crisis of low prices, and I think that that's a really interesting observation about the sort of changed nature of the debates that we're seeing today. And Tony, you put out a paper shortly after you left being commissioner that was about a different crisis, but it was an identity crisis. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about what your experiences and where you think that leaves us today.
Sure, yeah, you bet. And thinking back over the arc of my career, which a lot of it was on the state side as opposed to FERC. I spent 4.5 years at FERC, but about 12 years on the state commission. A lot of the things that I'll talk about probably sound pretty similar to some of the things that Joe had teed up as well. I mean, in looking at the arc of what has changed over about the 16 years or so that I was on commissions, and leading into that issue of the identity crisis that we face today in markets, clearly number one in my mind, the dominant, biggest issue in energy and its impact on electricity and everything else in the last, not just 10 years, but probably the last 50 years, is the advent of shale gas, shale oil, and has had such a tremendous impact in ways that sometimes I have to step back and think just how quickly the world changed within a few very, very short years. I had a similar experience on the state commission. I was one of those state regulators overseeing retail rates passing along natural gas fuel costs to LDC customers and electric fuel cost adjustments when gas was what it was. And being an elected commissioner, those weren't the most pleasant years to be on a commission. And I used to tell this story when we would talk about different fuel generation mixes. Sam Bodman, who was Secretary of Energy at the time, had this great quote that was, using natural gas to produce electricity is like washing your dishes in your best scotch. And I thought, oh, this is a great quote. So I'd go around speaking and I'd quote it everywhere. And about 2006 or 7, I realized I can't say that anymore. It doesn't work. Now we use natural gas for everything because the world changed with the shale revolution, in terms of how we view natural gas, in terms of its impact on the markets, and in terms of its impact on the electricity markets specifically, in terms of its impact on the environment. I mean, the U.S. environmental record in terms of carbon emissions is enviable because of the advent of shale gas that happened at the time that it did, and we were able to drive down carbon emissions in a way that as I said, Europe would be envious of, and did it at a relatively affordable cost to consumers. So that changed everything. Number one is having a tremendous impact on the markets now. Number two, a technological shift that has happened, which is we're in the midst of it, and it's having a profound impact on not just regulators, but on the industry itself, which is the shift from all of the power of the network, all of the power of the grid being centered in the center of the network, moving towards power being at the edge of the network. And when I say power at the edge, I mean both in a literal and a figurative sense. So in the literal sense, power at the center of the network, you always had central generating large generation units. We still have a lot of those, but what you're seeing is more and more power at the edge of the network in terms of rooftop distributed generation, other resources that are at the edge, which impacts how the grid operates, number one. But in a figurative sense, there's more power at the edge of the network, in that consumers have more options and ability to interact with the grid that they never had before, so that at certain times during the day, they are consumers of the grid, and at certain times of the day, they are producing power and putting it on the grid. All of this is having a tremendous impact, frankly, in some parts of the country more than others, and how fast some of these things get adopted will depend on a lot of different things that maybe we'll talk about a little bit later in our session. A third area which has, I think, come even more into the fore, although it's always been there, is this tension between the power of markets and the power of politics. And we've seen it in a big way in the electricity sector. If you think back to 15, 20 years ago, when you had a lot of debates on within state legislatures, within state government, about whether utilities should be unbundled or not, whether you should have wholesale merchant generators providing power, and they would make decisions based simply on the power of markets and these wholesale markets that FERC was setting up, and that would be how they would determine whether to shut down plants, invest in new plants, so on and so forth. There was a deal that was made by those states that decided to unbundle, which was, we're going to shift those risks onto shareholders and away from captive ratepayers, number one. Number two, we're going to let markets decide which units stay and which units go. And by virtue of the way the Federal Power Act works, that gives a lot of authority to FERC and takes a lot of authority out of the state hands, because, of course, wholesale sales are a federally jurisdictional activity. What's happened in recent years, in my mind, is you've had a bit of a, I think in a sense, buyer's remorse. Some of it, at least it's how it's being expressed in some of these states that did restructure. And I think Joe identified some of the reason for it. It's the challenge of having prices too low, and then the impact of what that means on the grid. But there's a whole lot of other things that go along with this that really get back to this idea of the political economy and still what an important role it plays in this particular sector of the economy. So, I mean, you have states from New York to Illinois to other restructured states. There's a big debate going on in Connecticut right now. There's debates going on in Ohio about all these states that restructured, that in some way or another, for sometimes laudable goals, but are kind of saying, well, wait a second, we'd like to kind of plan this grid too. We like the market. As one person once put it to me when they were visiting at FERC, we'd like to have our market cake, but choose our integrated resource plan too. And it's very tough to live in that world where you have, on one hand, some sort of market signal, but on another, still wanting to plan the grid for whatever reason. In Illinois, they didn't make much pretense about it. I think the name of the bill is like the Illinois Future Jobs Bill or something. I mean, it's specifically targeted as a jobs bill. Some of the recent debates in Connecticut have been very job-centric. In New York, it seemed to take on probably more of a debate about keeping carbon-free resources in the state with large nuclear plants. But all of it, I think, is really this idea that It's this tension between markets and politics in a very, very big way. And then the fourth thing that I noted, which has been a big change over the years that I've been involved, is what Joe had identified, this tension between the need for increased investment in infrastructure and trying to do it at a time that is very, very challenging to build that infrastructure. And we have a heightened awareness and a heightened sort of interest in the stakeholder processes that all regulatory commissions have to deal with, whether you're talking about transmission lines, electric transmission lines, which I, for the longest time, always thought were more difficult to cite than pipelines, or whether you're talking about pipelines now, which I think may be even more difficult to cite than electric transmission lines for a whole different set of reasons.
Great. Well, thank you. And I think I'd like to get back to that sort of transmission line versus pipeline. And both of you have raised the issue of the added burden responsibility at FERC of having to actually litigate a lot of these things as well. And I know Charlie Curtis has brought up on many occasions just the different nature of the regulatory process these days being so decided through litigation that it really makes it very hard to sort of find an end to some of these conversations. Emily, you guys represent a whole bunch of people who are playing in these markets and have probably a wide range of views on a lot of these issues. Can you talk about, when you're thinking about what are the major forces that you're grappling with at EEI, how you prioritize them and go after talking about them?
You set me up well to say the first thing I have to say, which is that nothing I say is reflective of any of the things that my members think, especially because Joe is one of them and probably some others out in the room. I think I'm here in part because I've spent the last 4 or 5 years talking about carbon regulation, and actually, thank you, one of my most favorite things to do is to talk about it with Doug, and so I get to do that again today. But that's actually not what I'm going to focus on. If we're talking about past, present, and future, definitely the present, we're going to talk about carbon regulation, and there's some things we should talk about in terms of the future. But actually, what I think about in terms of what we're prioritizing and how we're sort of focused as an institute right now is to pick up on something that Commissioner Clark said, which is all of the resources that are now being connected, as you said, on the edge of the grid. We're a federally facing entity. I've spent lots of time talking to federal regulators about how they're handling energy and environmental policy, and we find that we're spending so much more time talking to state regulators. Because the resources that you were talking about, storage, microgrids, rooftop solar, private solar, all of those things are interconnected with the distribution system. And so that's a different kind of conversation. And so the kinds of issues that we're thinking about are entirely different. Some of them are operational issues that I would not have dreamed that we would have been talking about in the past. As I think you were also mentioning, Commissioner Clark, we started with central station power and we built big, long transmission lines to get it places. And now we're having resources connected to the distribution system. And that was a one-way flow of power, and we sort of had a good sense on the transmission side of where it was going. And then on the distribution side, we had a decent amount of oversight of what was going on, but you didn't need a level of granularity. But now it's a two-way flow in many places, and you're looking at what's going on in California and Hawaii that have a really high level of deployment of private solar. Power is going back and forth all the time, and companies don't necessarily have the visibility or the ability to manage those transactions that might be necessary to preserve the reliability of the grid, but also to make sure that we're using those resources in the way that allow them to provide the most value. And so that's the other question is, well, how do you value those resources and how do you compensate them? Do you need to create markets? Can we create markets? On the distribution side, on the retail side, we have always done cost of service regulation, and that has been deemed by many states as the way to ensure the lowest cost power to consumers. And lots of people are entering this conversation saying, well, let's look at the value of what we're bringing, and trying to squish value concepts into cost of service sort of rubrics is hard, and it gets kind of messy, and it makes people get grumpy. Because it's maybe more than grumpy. We've been in some more contentious discussions about that. But you have to figure out how to compensate these resources. And the flip side is then you also have to figure out how to compensate the distribution system, because it is even more important than it was before. A lot of those resources that we're connecting to the edges of the grid rely on their ability to move power to different places, or rely on their ability to, I don't necessarily like this as an analogy, but use the grid as storage. So you have to figure out how to value these things to make sure that we continue to make the right investments and that we value different resources and the different sort of benefits they could bring. It also makes us think more about cybersecurity on the distribution system level. You start hooking a lot of stuff onto there, you create more opportunities for people to have access to a system that really they didn't have access to before. Also, those resources could provide increased resiliency, so you have to look at all of those issues. So it's kind of strange for me. I like talking about climate policy and I like talking about federal regulation, and I find I spend much more time talking about state regulation. And I would not have anticipated that in the same way that we wouldn't have anticipated the shale revolution. Really, the advent of technology is pushing us and pushing our regulatory structures on both the federal and the state level. And I think that's where the conversation will go forward, is involving state regulators in those conversations. And they want to keep their IRPs on some level. They also have very different opinions about what their future should look like. So that's sort of a future forward look.
That's great. I mean, I appreciate you bringing in a couple of different, ideas that we had not talked about yet. One is this concept of attribute-based pricing, right? And trying to deal with all of the things that that various sources and locations of sources bring to the electric power sector, and really the way in which people are experimenting with that now, and what that means for policy longer term. And then the other that you raised is cybersecurity, which I think oftentimes you're either at a conversation about cybersecurity or you're not at a conversation about cybersecurity, and people tend not to mix those two. So I think it's great that you brought that up. Michelle, I wanted to bring you into this conversation because I think Microsoft is a big player in a lot of different ways in what you guys are doing, in the way you're choosing to interact with the power markets where you have a presence, and I wanted you to be able to characterize that and talk about how you guys are thinking about the future.
Great, well thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here and to bring the customer perspective and the technology provider perspective to the panel. So most people don't think about Microsoft when you think about energy, but it is increasingly important to our business. It's important because we are a growing consumer of energy. It's important because we are an owner and operator of a lot of behind-the-meter assets that you heard talked about, if it's storage, if it's backup generators, that we want to be able to put to work for the grid. And it's important for our customers. There's been a tremendous advance in cloud computing over the last few years, and frankly the last few months, that's providing tools to customers throughout the energy supply chain to better balance the grid, to manage their energy use, to do predictive maintenance on pipelines and reservoirs, and to be the backup and the backbone really for electric cars. So it's a very exciting time for technology companies, and particularly Microsoft in the space. What I want to talk about today is the growing energy needs of these customers, the challenges that these corporate customers are facing in meeting those needs, and the types of technologies that can be brought to bear for some of these resilience and reliability questions. So just starting on energy needs, to give you a sense of scale, how many of you think Microsoft consumes as much energy as a town? Raise your hand. How many of you think Microsoft consumes as much energy as a city? How many of you think Microsoft consumes as much energy as a state?
Which one? I'm just
kidding. You should all raise your hand, because we consume as much energy as a small state, say the state of Vermont or Alaska, and it's possible that in the next few years we could consume more energy than the largest utility in the United States. And the same is true for a lot of the other cloud companies. And this is not necessarily a net gain or gross gain in demand. It's balanced by losses elsewhere as more folks are moving their on-prem energy or their cloud to Microsoft and to other cloud. But it creates an opportunity and responsibility for Microsoft to deploy more clean energy. And so we've set ambitious targets to get more and more of our energy from clean sources, from solar, wind, and hydro, 50% by the end of next year, 60% by early 2020, and to keep going from there. And we're not alone. If you look at the top Fortune 100 companies, you'd see that 71% of them have similar clean energy and sustainability goals. And it's driven by several factors. First and foremost, it's driven by costs. We got tough CFOs, and we need to make sure that it pencils in. It's driven by the demands of our customers and our shareholders, and to make sure that we are having we are not having a big footprint on the environment. And so you have these targets, and now companies are executing against this target, which brings me to the second point, which the challenges that consumers are facing in meeting these goals. Sometimes it's easy to buy renewables, and it's easy to buy them at the cost-effective ways, and sometimes it's not so easy. And so there are lots of conversations that are happening at the state level with utilities, with public utility commissions, to figure out ways to be able to access and to create the products that these consumers need, and to be able to access some of the cost reductions and to a certain extent the wholesale market pricing that is available. And what we've found, we're in a lot of these conversations, they're happening across the country, not just in the states you would think in California or New York, but they're happening in red states, they're happening in blue states, they're happening in regulated states and unregulated states. For us, we have these conversations in Virginia, in Texas, in Iowa, in Illinois, in Wyoming, in Washington, so really across the country. And we've found what's most successful is when you get everyone together and you realize what is the needs, what's the need of the utility, what's the need of the local community, what's the need of the public utility, and create innovative solutions. So 2 examples I want to share with you. One is in Wyoming and one's in Washington State. In Wyoming, we were looking to power a data center with wind. So we brought 250 megawatts of new wind online. The challenge is that the local utility, Black Hills, wanted to build a peaker plant. And they wanted to build a coal peaker, and they wanted to rate base it. So they were going to increase our price, but they were also going to increase the price of the local community. And no one wanted that to happen. And we realized that, well, we have backup generators on our data center that we never really use. So wouldn't it be interesting if we create an arrangement where the backup generators satisfy the reliability requirements and that the local utility is able to call on our backup generators to meet peak demand at certain times of the year for the city. And so that was a win-win situation for all of us. And instead of using diesel for our backup generators, we actually switched them to quick start high efficiency natural gas and catalyzed a market for that now. And so there's a lot of innovation that is happening there. In Washington State, we had ambitious targets that we wanted to meet for our campus. Our campus is the size of a city, and basically, and 125 buildings. And so we wanted to move faster in the deployment of carbon-free energy, but we wanted to do it in a way that made the local ratepayers whole, that helped the community, and that also addressed the local utilities needs. And so this was a contract that we just got approved by the local utility commission in Washington with Puget Sound, and we are leaving the utility. We paid a transition fee of about $24 million that will be refunded back to the ratepayers in order to be able to go and procure directly our energy for our campus, just the generation. We're going to continue to be a transmission and distribution customer to the local utility. We've contractually obligated ourselves to 100% carbon-free energy, including wind and solar. That is triple what is required by the utility in the state. And we're going to continue to pay into the local programs, the conservation programs, the low-income programs. Actually, we increased it by 150% so that we're taking care of the local community. So figuring out those win-win situations, what everyone needs, what their concerns are, is what we've seen to be successful in this space. Finally, bringing me to the last point, which is the advanced technologies that can enhance reliability and resilience. Let me just start that reliability is critical to our business. Mission critical. We run data centers that run 24/7. We need energy all the time. That's why for every megawatt we pull from the grid, we have a backup battery and we have a backup generator for every megawatt, because it's got to run. So we really understand this concept. And that's why we're investing a lot in battery storage. And we have a research and development program going on with the University of Texas. We have a pilot program right now in our Virginia data center to make sure that this is working right. That's why we work to catalyze this market on high efficiency quick start natural gas generators, so that they can provide the backup that you need. Next week, we're inaugurating an exciting new project in Seattle, a fuel cell, where you directly inject natural gas into the building to be able, you cut down the infrastructure in half and you double the efficiency. So we're thinking of very different ways that we can address these issues, and there's a lot of technology that can be brought to bear for reliability and for resilience, and figuring out the behind the meter participation piece is critical. So we're excited about those conversations that are happening at the state level and the FERC at FERC as well. So it's an exciting time. It's an exciting time for companies like us in this space, and we look forward to the conversation.
That's great. Thanks, Michelle. It's just such an energizing set of activities that you guys, and sorry about the pun, but at least I didn't say electrifying, a set of activities you guys have underway. And one of the things I find the most interesting about the case of Microsoft and other companies like yours is not only that you're a great example of how commercial consumers are taking the future of their consumption into their own hands and starting to work with local decision makers about how to do that. But also, I don't know if you all find this, but sometimes when I go to conferences about the future of the utility, they're essentially trying to mimic the model of Microsoft, and not directly, but essentially this idea that eventually we're going to get to a place where the selling of electricity is actually not the most valuable part of the business proposition, but it's the services, it's the behind the meter stuff, it's the technology, it's the data, it's all of that that's going to make the value proposition. And that's still a little, it's not everybody's worldview, but I do find that there's those two sort of interesting edges of watching what you guys are doing as an example. So I'm going to put Doug on the spot because we have talked about a lot of different things that are out there. And I don't know about you, but sometimes when I'm involved in these discussions, I need some prioritization. What are we going to talk about first? What do we expect to be high on the list of the issues that we've discussed, either from a public policy making standpoint or a regulatory standpoint? And how do you see that landscape, Doug?
Okay, thank you. I guess first I just want to thank my panelists, co-panelists, our leader here, and all of you for being here. Bob Nordhaus was a mentor of mine, and he loved nothing more than sort of a rich discussion of policy issues. So I think this is the perfect way to sort of honor his memory. I was warned that I might be asked to prioritize, so being a child of the 70s and 80s, I thought, oh, well, that needs a top 10 list. So, unfortunately, my list is longer than 10, it's 12, but that's because I included some state issues. So here's my list, and I'll go through fast, because if I have 7 minutes, that means I have 40 seconds per issue. Okay, number 12. Natural gas pipeline infrastructure. So that used to be sort of a no-brainer, but now the electric sector is more and more dependent on natural gas pipeline infrastructure because we have more gas-fired generation. The gas-fired generation has typically used interruptible pipeline service. And one question is that okay in a world where we're more and more relying on it to be there at peak times and when there's peak load on the pipeline? If it's not okay, will that drive more pipeline construction? Will LSEs, will states, will RTOs? There's been a discussion in New England about who, if anybody, might be willing to pay for more firm pipeline capacity in New England, and so far the answer to that is nobody is. So we'll see how that develops. States, one of the problems with New England is it's on the other side of New York from where the gas is. So New York has been not too excited about generally allowing pipeline construction through its state. So, and states have some leverage over this under statutes like the Clean Water Act. So, one thing. Number 11, changes in federal statute. So people ask me, is the Congress going to change the Federal Power Act? I think the answer to that's no. I think there's nowhere near a consensus about what you would do to the Federal Power Act, except perhaps with regard to reforms to Part 1 that has to do with hydro licensing, for which there's been an ongoing discussion. It seems to me there's more question about whether there might be a stomach for reforming PURPA and the PURPA must-buy requirements. I won't go into the history of PURPA. We can talk more about that if anybody cares to. But the question is, PURPA was invented in 1978 when there essentially were not competitive wholesale markets. There was not access to transmission. The question is, what about PURPA still makes sense in the current world, and who does it make sense for? And it's occurred to me that there might be a trade-off for some further narrowing of the must-buy requirement for maybe rethinking, for instance, the state role about distributed generation, which is now sort of cobbled together under this net metering rationale, which doesn't really make a lot of sense, but is what we've used because that was the way to avoid the jurisdictional problem. Number 10, we're moving towards running out of the renewable federal tax credits. The Clean Power Plan isn't going to happen anytime in the near future. So the question is, what happens to the pace of renewable energy development in a world where you have state RPS requirements, but you no longer have federal tax credits, which I think were, in many cases, the principal financial driver of those investments. And in fact, you see now people trying to get big projects in before that we get to the the end of these phase-out periods. Next, will we, I'm on number 9, if you're keeping track. So what are we going to do about transmission infrastructure investment? Are we going to keep working on that? FERC thinks it's done good work. I believe it has done good work in something called Order 1000, which tried to get regions organized for thinking about transmission planning and transmission cost allocation. I would say it didn't resolve a lot of transmission cost allocation questions, which makes it hard to build particularly transmission that's not obviously needed for reliability, because that gets you sort of automatically into fights about who's going to pay for the transmission. Secondly, there's been more state obstruction of building new, especially multi-state transmission lines. And so there's going to be a question. We talked a little bit about the differences between gas pipeline siting and transmission siting. Those statutory structures are different. I don't think there's going to be any stomach for preempting states on transmission siting, but it's going to be, I think, a more and more visible problem. Number 8, Michelle talked about Microsoft. I think there's just sort of a general question for the electric sector about what do they do with these big new electricity customers that want cheap power and they want green power and they may want some other characteristics of their power, and how does that fit with the sort of basic retail regulatory regime that we have in the states. Number 7, relatedly, are we going to see sort of big changes in state retail rate making? In part because of debates in the states about net metering, there's been a discussion of essentially redoing the way retail rates are constructed so that there's less money collected in energy charges and more money collected in either monthly customer charges or demand charges. And that probably really reflects the sort of cost incurrence of the utility, but it's not what people are used to. And it's going to be a disruptive change if people try to move too fast in that direction. And that has implications for energy efficiency, has implications for distributed storage, for distributed generation. Related to that, at least one state, New York, has done a lot of work on sort of rethinking the distribution utility model. They have something called Reforming the Energy Vision, the REV process. And there's sort of a question about whether that's going to become, is New York going to successfully get that adopted, and what real world change is that going to make? And B, if they do, does that become a model that gets taken up by other states? We talked a little bit in the first panel about electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are probably a longer term issue. It's a potentially gigantic change for the electric sector because you could be the new fuel for the transportation sector, which would be a gigantic addition of load. That's a long-term issue, and it raises a whole long list of questions about who has what role in vehicle charging. Is that something utilities do? Is it something third parties do? Is it something governments do? Is it something landlords do? How does that get done, and how does it get regulated? Number 4, what are states going to do in terms of, states in the organized markets going to do in terms of trying to shape generation choices? There's people may be aware there was a Supreme Court decision called Hughes in the spring of 2016, which disallowed, found to be preempted, a Maryland state policy that would have provided for development of gas combined cycle generation in Maryland. Found that was preempted by its interference with wholesale markets regulated by FERC. Since then, we've had states think of various other ways they'd like to intervene in markets, and they've, I guess, been somewhat more clever about not announcing that they were intervening in FERC markets, and which is probably a good legal strategy on their part. And instead, as we talked about again earlier, talked about job preservation, preserving environmental, low carbon generation. So there's litigation that's working it's been through the Second Circuit on Connecticut policies. There's litigation that's working its way through the courts about the New York and Illinois ZEC programs. And I guess the way I read the Hughes program is as long as you're smart about designing it, states could probably come up with all sorts of interventions that wouldn't be preempted. I guess another question is, would Congress get so frustrated by some of those interventions that it might change the statute? That seems unlikely to me. Number 3, who's in charge of making sure we have enough capacity? Or have enough generation. So in the organized markets, especially in the Northeast, we've relied on capacity markets. I would say that's been about the least satisfying regulatory initiative that the FERC has undertaken in the last 10 years, because nobody seems to be happy with capacity markets. And this DOE NOPR recently is sort of a different form of intervention that raises, in my mind, a question of, do we need to think a little bit about sort of a new regulatory compact for generation investors in organized markets? What's the deal they're signing up for? And could that be constructed in a more stable way than it is now? Related to that, we have these recent experiences with the nuclear plants in South Carolina and maybe Georgia, and the CCS plant in, where is it, in Alabama? Mississippi. Kemper, that have become hugely, these are low carbon or zero carbon plants that vertically integrated utilities were investing in, with support from state statute or state regulators about cost recovery, that turned out to be wildly more expensive than people expected them to be. And the question is how, what is that a model? Is that a model people are going to keep being willing to use if you're a state legislature or a state regulator? And I think, we're going to see what happens in South Carolina, for instance. Number 2, what are the steps needed to ensure physical and cyber security? I think this is sort of a big, scary topic that it's hard to think we have this totally under control, which is what I think we would like to be able to. I think the sector, the government would like to be able to say we have this totally under control. I think the bottom line is no one knows exactly what it means to have it totally under control. And I don't know whether that means we could do any better, but I think it's a topic that's going to get continued attention. And then finally, I raised just the recent experience with what happens sort of after the hurricanes in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. So obviously the first question is just how are they going to get their service back, and how are we going to sort of manage that disaster? I think, secondly, it's sort of an example of, look how damn important electricity is to the functioning of civil society. Imagine if Maryland wasn't going to have electricity for 6 months. Can you imagine the politics of that? It wouldn't be good. So it's just sort of a reminder of how important this whole exercise is, making all these pieces fit together. So that's my top 12.
That's great. Thank you very much. So I liked the top 12, and I liked the sort of Casey Kasem-esque, high 12 to 1 sort of countdown. Okay, I'm going to cherry pick from a few of those, because I think we could talk a lot about each of them. But there are a few that seem to be of interest to most people, particularly right now. And I think the first among them is the Clean Power Plan. So not unexpectedly, the administration has announced its intent, or it has repealed the Clean Power Plan, and announced an intent in some way, shape, or form to consider a new one. And we can talk about whether you think they legitimately did that or not. But it wasn't unexpected, I guess. But there's some live debates about what it actually means. So I'm interested in your views about, one, what comes next? If you look into your crystal ball, what do you think the EPA is going to do? What is sort of, the sort of most legally rational things for them to do? What do you think the politically driven things are for them to do? What do you think states will do in response? And ultimately, when it comes to people making investments in the electric power sector, does it matter? So I'm happy to start with anybody who wants to.
I can answer your last question. Great. I'm not so sure it matters, which is kind of hard for me to say given the amount of time I've spent on the clean power plan.
Well, you didn't know it wasn't going to matter at the time.
I wasn't, in the same way that shale was sort of unexpected. We devoted 2014 to talking about regulation of carbon under Section 111B and 111D. It was a very long year. And at the time, we didn't know some things, and there were some things we didn't know. And one of them was we were going to shut down a lot of coal units in 2015 in response to mercury neurotoxic standards. And I think we had a sense that was, I knew that was the compliance deadline, which was April 16, 2015, with a year extension if you wanted one, maybe 2 if you had a reliability issue. But people weren't, and the rule was finalized in 2012. No one said, well, I'm going to close all my coal units. But and that was also right as shale prices started to really tick down. And so, we were really worried in 2015 about the timeline. We said this is going to start in 2020 and we have to make massive reductions by 2030. It felt like a really big challenge. And then we filed the comments on December 1, 2014. The rule went final in August. And then the end of 2015, we started getting the preliminary emissions data in, and we were down a lot. So it was about 15 or 16% below 2005 levels at the end of 2015, and the clean power plants, the EPA estimated that if you implemented the rule, that you would get to like 30 or 32% below 2005 levels. So I was like, so we're at 15, and now we're like 5 years before the start of the program, or even more because they delayed the start to 2022. And then at the end of last year, we're almost 25% below 2005 levels. So that's a lot. It's a very long way toward that goal. And a lot of that is because of the transition, not only from coal to gas, but also just a large increase in the amount of electricity we get from renewables. It's still small comparatively, but nationally it's about, I think, almost 15% if you include hydro, which is a dramatic change from where it was in 2005. So I think the drivers of those emissions reductions are not regulatory in nature, although of course state renewable portfolio standards are really important. But the drivers are largely economic, cost of natural gas, the declining cost of renewables, and customer interest in the renewables. I don't see that changing whether or not we have a clean power plan. Mm-hmm. I think for many people, even the clean power plan, even though it felt to us like it was going to be a challenge, is not enough given the magnitude of the climate challenge, and people would like to see more and more faster. But I don't know that we're going to see. I was at another meeting and someone was like, well, there's no clean power plan. The power sector is going back to its old ways. And I was like, I don't see that. We've closed coal. I think we'll continue to close coal as it finishes its remaining useful life. That looks like a pretty likely outcome through 2030. So I don't think we're going anywhere that's different than where the Clean Power Plan was trying to get us.
Okay. Michelle?
Just to add to that, so this happened 3 years ago. At the time, it was seen as the key driver. And it's really now one of many, many data points, the data points that were just discussed. But in some ways, you have federal policy more broadly sandwiched between really powerful drivers at the state level and international, which are really continuing to keep us on this path to this transition to cleaner fuels and to a low carbon economy. And so these federal policies, while they're significant and debate about what happens next, can change the dial of the pace and the scale at which it happens. It's very unlikely to change the direction because it's just sandwiched by these more powerful forces.
Jeff?
Yeah, NextEra Energy is the largest wind generator in the world and one of the biggest solar generators. And we viewed the Clean Power Plan as a very, very small thing when it came to demand for wind and solar. When it was issued, the White House called it transformative. It was going to transform the electricity sector, and it really didn't. What it would do is strengthen or reinforce existing trends that were all very strong, right? Declining cost of solar, improving technology of wind, shift away from coal. And one of the best statements on how important was the Clean Power Plan came right after the election. The day after the election, one of the CEOs of one of the largest coal-burning utilities was asked, are you going to change your plans? Are you going to reverse some retirement decisions? And he said, no, we're not going to change any plan. This is driven all by economics, the price of natural gas. So it wasn't, those decisions he was conceding were not driven by the war on coal, but by the fundamental relationship between coal and gas prices. So if the Clean Power Plan didn't really have much impact on new wind and solar, then its termination similarly it's in the margins if it even registers. But I thought the EPA proposal was well done. It's not the most complicated legal argument to say it was a stretch in EPA's authority. I'm not a Clean Air Act maven, so I should concede that. But I thought the proposal was sort of well done. But my understanding of the Clean Air Act is once the endangerment finding is made and you're regulating these emissions from mobile sources, you have to regulate them from stationary sources at some point in some manner. So the ANOPR, I guess there's going to be an ANOPR that will be some kind of hint on how they might propose to regulate it, unless they reverse the endangerment finding itself.
Any thoughts on what pathway they might take, from here? Because I think there are some questions and perhaps unanswered questions about what the next step in the strategy will be.
I don't want to read into the proposed repeal and the legal argument too much, but the fact that they chose to say that the definition of best system of emission reduction that the prior EPA espoused, which was very broad, should be more narrowly construed, could seem to imply to me that they're thinking about a replacement rule that would be based on a narrower interpretation of BSER, which would, as they said in the repeal, measures and reductions that could be achieved at the unit itself, very specific to what can you do to this unit instead of looking at the power sector as a whole and looking at shifting generation between different forms, different generators. So that might make me think that maybe they're thinking about a replacement rule, but they could still, and some of the things you've heard, there might still be a desire to go after the endangerment findings, because that would take Clean Air Act regulation sort of off the table, not just for the power sector, but for everyone, if that's a goal. But there's still also the horribly complicated, and I don't really want to talk about it, 112 argument, which is this, it was fully briefed before the DC Circuit, but this argument that if you have the mercury neurotoxic standards that I mentioned, you could read section 111D, and maybe now would be a good time that we could wish that Bob were here to tell us what he meant when he wrote that. There's an argument that if you have standards for the power sector under 111D, or under 112, that you can't have a 111D rule. And it didn't seem, I sat through oral argument last September, and it didn't seem to me that the DC Circuit was buying it, but you could give that a whirl again. So they have some options. I'm not sure that I'm 100% convinced that they're going to do a replacement rule based on the repeal, but it kind of seems like they're going that way. But it would be a much narrower rule, and it would not really drive, if we didn't think that this rule was going to drive additional reductions, that rule wouldn't at all.
So it seems like consensus is that the Clean Power Plan in and of itself wasn't going to lead the industry anywhere. It wasn't already going, but there was a presumption that it was a pathway or a mechanism to have the CPP 2.0.
If I could add one thing, I think if you looked at a nationwide perspective at the general trend line, that's true. I think where CPP, and this is what made it so politically difficult for so many reasons, is it did impact different parts and different regions of the country differently. And it had to do with a lot of choices that were made with regard to timelines, what was counted, what wasn't, all of those things that were built into the cake. So some parts of the country, it really was a non-event. For places like North Dakota, that was looking at a 40% reduction on relatively new coal plants, there was hundreds of millions of dollars of stranded investment. So, while I would agree with the panel, there were sort of precise impacts in certain parts of the country. And if you get enough of those states that are impacted heavily, it makes it really politically tough to move things forward.
That's an excellent point, and I can remember talking to EPA, because I think I think if you're a climate person or if you're an economist, it seems so obvious that you would elect to take the trading option. They said, why don't all the states get together and trade? Because there were clearly some states that had excess emissions. And you can have the conversation about whether California was ever going to let anyone have their excess emissions, because I would argue that they were not about to do that. But EPA was like, trade, this will all be fine. And we were like, not everyone's going to do that, and that's going to make this harder. And they were like, what do you mean? And we were like, some states aren't going to do what you think they're going to do, and that is going to make compliance a lot harder for North Dakota, Kentucky, West Virginia. Yeah.
Thank you for, Doug, go ahead.
I was just going to say, even if EPA were to pursue a narrower, sort of within the fence approach rule, that's not necessarily simple. because trying to figure out what could be achieved through efficiency improvements at different kinds of plants is a complicated technical question. And then there's sort of a second order question, which is, assuming that's the basis for figuring out what the standards are you nonetheless going to give regulated units the flexibility of using a sort of more trading-based approach, which you could do, but then it sounds almost like an endorsement of the Clean Power Plan, so it seems politically unattractive to do that. So if they decide to tackle what sounds like a narrower issue, it's still a hard issue, I guess is my point.
So thank you for bringing up the difference in the state perspectives, because I think it does get to one of the issues I was curious about, which is the absence of this CPP, whether it was a driver for change or not, is almost as big a political issue as the sort of origin of the CPP. And so one of the questions I have is whether or not you're going to start to see states taking a reaction to the absence of CPP. Some states basically saying, no, we're still going to meet our commitment. Do you think that anybody is, there's going to be more of that, and are you hearing about talk? I mean, other than sort of the Brown, Bloomberg, hey, we're going to meet our Paris climate commitments stuff, is there more that the states can do to sort of drive themselves further or faster, or are the states that are basically being leaders doing all they can?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think you'll see that the biggest champions of states' rights in the energy space are going to be big blue states on the West Coast and on the East Coast, probably. And you see it already. I mean, you have some states that are moving aggressively forward, others that will probably sort of muddle their way through and probably try to buy a little bit of time until whatever 2.0 looks like, but we don't know what that is yet. Yeah. But one thing I can predict is litigation.
Good, okay.
To your first question, there will be plenty of that.
Yeah, Michelle.
And there are things that are happening in states that might achieve the same goals but aren't done for the same reasons, right? And so the same conversations, if it's about consumer choice, these are economic conversations that are happening, and you have discussions about community solar, or discussions about green tariffs, or discussions about market or direct access or market-based pricing, and those can drive you maybe not to the same goals, exact emission goals, and those are the metrics that are being used, but they can drive a real change in the fuel mix of those states. Yeah.
And I guess I would just observe that I think, as Tony pointed out, I think Democratic politicians, whether they're mayors or governors or state legislators or county commissioners or whatever they are going to look for ways to be good on climate change, and that's cleanest if you happen to be in control of a state government. But there are states, there are cities, for instance, that are thinking about what kinds of climate policies they can adopt. Some of them have their own municipal utilities. Some of them, many of them, all of them, are big customers themselves. I think the issue's not going to die. There's going to be a troop of politicians at all levels that continue to be interested in this. I think at some level they're free to, let's put it this way. I think the collective of those actions is almost surely going to be less efficient than if we tackled it at a national level. And it's going to have different distributional effects, both.
Okay. So one of my favorite things about living in Washington is you can go, a very short period of time with all of a sudden a nonsensical term like DOE NOPR means something to everybody. And we're in one of those periods now. So we have this other thing that Doug and others have alluded to, which is that the Department of Energy has used some of its authority to tell the FERC to basically come up with or issue a rule for the reliability of assets that can hold reserves above 90 days on site. And so we're going through that 60-day sprint right now. One of the funny things that I find about this is that it sort of came out as an action and now is being discussed that was mandating a final outcome. It is now being discussed as an action that was meant to start a conversation. And now lots of people asking, what was it after in the first place? So does somebody have a sense of what they think DOE wanted out of this process and what we know about how FERC is responding to that request.
Well, I think, so, I mean, in terms of the movement of the discussion towards, maybe this was a discussion starter, I think part of that is probably a realization that, I mean, number one, this hasn't been used a lot. So this is a tool that everyone's sort of trying to figure out exactly how it works, right? So a proposal has been put out now. But then you get into really thorny questions of things like, okay, how thorough does the rule have to be in terms of what it proposes so that a record can be built, so that it can can be upheld upon judicial review. All right, so there's questions about that. Technically, what does FERC have to do if it's going to implement it? Does it actually have to 206? In other words, find unjust and unreasonable the existing rate that's there? Well, that's probably a step that they would need to take as well. So there's all of these kind of incremental steps that people start thinking about, and I suppose at a certain point you say, well, we're starting the conversation about how to get there, which nominally is about this issue of resiliency, which is quite honestly a little bit of a gray area up to this point at least at the federal level. To me, it sounds resiliency sounds an awful lot like resource adequacy as it's discussed traditionally at the state level, because it's a combination of reliability, which is really an engineering exercise, which is a relatively hard science, and combines it with notions of what does it mean to have a diverse fuel supply? What does security really mean? Is there a reason to have diversity of fuel supply and security of fuel supply for the sake of that itself? Those are really, in many ways, resource adequacy questions. They're important questions, but they're typically beyond what FERC has done up to this point, which is really to focus more on sort of within the context of market mechanisms, what does a just and reasonable rate mean? So it has stirred up conversation, if nothing else. I would also say, in relation to some of the conversation that we had during our opening comments, in some ways it's an extension of the politics that we've seen in the electricity space for some period of time. It's different in that it's a proposal to FERC to adopt a rule in this regard. But at the same time, if you look at there are plenty of policy interventions that impact the electricity markets, from production tax credits to other things that FERC has done over the years with regard to the 2.5% holdback in capacity markets and PJM, which was a means of spurring demand response and energy efficiency. There are lots of policy choices that are made. This is obviously a big one, and you're seeing a lot of commentary reflective of that.
Mm-hmm.
I think Bob would have been very interested in reading the DOE NOPR probably. And as a former DOE general counsel, he'd probably be a little disappointed in the proposal. But this authority has been used 4 times in the last 40 years. It's never been used in the electricity area, always in gas. Last time it was used was 1985, after extensive consultations between FERC and DOE. I think it's hard to avoid the conclusion that DOE expected FERC to approve the proposal. So it was supposed to be more than a conversation starter, because one part of the proposal said that they asked FERC to approve their proposal on an interim basis before reviewing public comment. So that's more than a conversation starter. But I think it's fair. DOE has, if we're taking this as a conversation, DOE's has posed a question or presented a question. They haven't posed a question, they posed an answer. But they're presenting, I think it's fair to say FERC could take this as DOE's presenting an issue, and FERC is asking a question. Are there legitimate resiliency issues? What does resiliency mean? Does it mean different things in different regions? And should there be some kind of regional proceedings to look at what does resiliency mean in California versus PJM? Mm-hmm. Is there a resiliency issue in different regions? Are the solutions very different? And it could be in the end result is, in some regions there's no resiliency issue, in other regions there are resiliency issues, but the region has it in hand and has proposals or solutions in hand. Or it could be that there's resiliency issues in some regions and they're somehow not addressing them, or not acting, and FERC might need to nudge them. So, it's very interesting topic. It's unusual to have such a short comment period on such a sweeping proposal. And Monday is filing day, and I would think the filings are going to be very lopsided. So I think there will be minimal support. But then the question then turns to, well, what happens next?
Right.
And should there be something at the regional level or not?
Yeah, I was just going to say, in terms of conversation starter, that may be even the more interesting question is what happens at the regional level, because there is more focus on some of these issues. FERC has had, for some time, opened this proceeding under an umbrella of price formation.
Yeah.
The low-hanging fruit, the Commission was able to deal with early on, and then the quorum issues came, and they weren't able to process anything until just recently. I wouldn't be surprised if this does kickstart a conversation more proactively and with some urgency deal with some of these market design issues, because there actually is in my opinion, there's a lot there for the Commission to sink its teeth into. I mean, you do have issues where you have large inflexible units that are still needed for the system, but because of the way the pricing works, they lose money simply by virtue of how the locational marginal price is set when they back down to minimum generation. I mean, those are real issues, real economic issues that need to be dealt with. And if this gets that conversation going, then in my mind, all the better.
Yeah. Emily,
I was going to attempt to touch on that last point, so I'm glad you did it, because you did it better than I would have. I see if I can do this without getting myself in trouble.
Let me get my pen out.
You let me know. I mean, I think Secretary Perry made it clear in April that he had a concern about the closure, what he deemed premature closure of nuclear and coal units, these inflexible units that you were referring to. And then DOE put out a staff study at the end of August that sort of said that they were still sort of concerned about that and sort of cataloged sort of the history of what's been going on in the power sector since like 2005 or 8. And it said, some of these units are closing earlier than we think they should be. Why is that? Should we be worried about it? So, I mean, I think it's not a secret that was the issue he was trying to address with the proposal. So that's the question is, and I think Chairman Chatterjee said recently, the Energy Bar Association had some meetings earlier this week, that he thinks that the proposal fits within their price formation conversations. I don't know what that means, but it sort of gets at what you're saying, which is maybe there are some price formation issues here that maybe we need to address in certain markets, and maybe that's the way you address concerns about the closure of units that might be still important for reliability.
I was just going to say that I think if you look at the sort of campaign, how this issue came up in the campaign, it was partly a critique of the Obama administration's sort of overzealous environmental regulation, but really focusing on the sort of domestic jobs impact of that. So politically, it's not irrational for the administration to say, well, we want to support these plants because they're good employers and they support coal mines and they're good employers. That's just, but if you said that to FERC would say, that's interesting, but that's not our job. Go think up a tax credit or think up something else to help them. So my sense is they sort of started with that political goal and then tried their hardest to fit it into something that looked like a Federal Power Act issue.
I would just add that the NOPR raises timely questions. Look what just happened in this country. So these are real questions. How do you maintain and recover from acts of, if it's sabotage or natural disasters? And we all have concerns about that. I think it's gotten framed so much around the issue of resiliency. It's important that issues about the customer and about prices are front and center in the conversation. The whole notion of competitive markets and the benefits of competitive markets remain front and center in the conversation, and the role of innovation and making sure that you're setting the right price signals and the right incentives for us to continue to innovate in this sector. The United States electricity sector has been an engine of innovation and should continue to be that. So making sure that those points are also front and center in the conversation is really key.
They're good points, Michelle, and I do think that, as many of you have said, it is being because it's happening so quickly, and it seemed to be a question that was posed with an answer to a question. It doesn't mean that there aren't legitimate issues there that we are all and have all been grappling with. I think the question is, And maybe the result of this will be coming up with a definition for the different attributes of resiliency or reliability that we're going to care about within this conversation. I do think, Doug, though, one of the things that you said was really interesting when Secretary Perry was testifying on this recently, and he gave an answer that I think a lot of people laughed at. And I probably did too at the initial reaction, to be entirely honest, which is, someone said, what's the cost-benefit analysis for this charge that you're putting on the markets? And he said, well, what's the price of freedom? And it was sort of like, well, that's not a cost-benefit analysis that I'm familiar with. However, though, when you come to the value of nuclear in the US economy conversation, there is a very strong element of that conversation that gets back to national security. We need a nuclear power sector, and whether you believe that or not, I'm not endorsing it. I'm just saying it is interesting that there are these jobs and security context, this national security context, that often gets thrown into the equation for the value of those assets. And it's not something that we price in, to the market. And it does allow for the folks that were doubtful about a transition to a much different electric power system, about the prospect of that happening without some sort of glitches or problems with variable energy resources or distributed energy resources, to weigh in on those doubts, I guess, right? So I think you guys are right. It does start that conversation and maybe moves it up on the priority list for going forward. Okay, we're going to come next to audience questions. The one thing I wanted to sort of elicit one last sort of round of comments from the panel on is, when Bob Nordhaus was last at CSIS, he gave us a talk. It was called The Hazy Bright Line between federal and state regulation. And he outlined in a master class kind of way what you talked about, Doug, which is sort of the division of labor between federal and state policymakers and in the electric power sector. I'm interested in the fact that we do have, at least one house in the Congress that is looking at some of these issues very seriously that are plaguing the electric power sector and asking questions about where authority should lie. Does anybody fundamentally see a change in sort of that division of power that would be something we're just not thinking about right now? Or did the flexibility that you alluded to earlier make that a manageable issue for now? Because a lot of this is sort of, who's got authority to do what, and should we be rethinking that compact? Everybody's like, I got that. Go ahead.
There's one area that I think is interesting. It could result in a shift without changing law, just by the wires being used differently. There's never been a bright line between transmission and distribution, right? Distribution is, people have tried voltage levels, but that doesn't work because there's very high voltage in New York City and LA that's used for distribution. But, so it's sort of been defined, well, it's where power only moves one way to retail customers. That stuff will spray paint as distribution. But at some point, if you get enough penetration of distributed generation, well, there's nowhere where power is just moving one way. And at some point, you already have this thing of wholesale transmission can occur over distribution lines. There already is that kind of category that exists. So it's a FERC jurisdictional transaction service that occurs over a distribution line. But if you don't know the line between transmission and distribution, and the rough line is where power moves only one way and power stops moving only one way, does that mean that transmission universe shrinks? And how does it shrink? Does it disappear like that? Is it when it's 51% penetration where power's moving both ways? I don't know, but FERC does not lust over jurisdiction over local distribution lines. I know that. So if I were FERC, I would think, oh God, as long as there's some scintilla of power that's moving one way, I'm happy with jurisdictional lines not changing. So that's the one where it seems that because it's a fuzzy, using Bob's term, there's a fuzzy line between transmission and distribution, and there is this like rough working definition. When that rough working definition doesn't really serve so well, does anything happen or does nothing happen?
Yeah, and I don't know where the line is going to end up. I do think in relation to your question about Congress, I think it's more likely to become clear because of actions that are taking place at FERC and in the courts than in Congress, though. And I'll be interested to watch, like I'm sure everyone is, this line of cases that's starting to work its way through the courts in terms of what is the outer boundary of a state's jurisdiction and where does federal jurisdiction begin. Doug had brought up the Hughes case, which contains some interesting, almost I would call dicta at the end of it, where they make the court makes the relatively clear line distinction that says that in that particular case, Maryland was clearly getting into a federal jurisdictional activity right at the heart of FERC wholesale authority, but then steps back just a bit and says, but there might be other things that states might do that conceivably could fall outside of this. And I think they even mentioned things like RECs and a few things like that. So they didn't quite go all the way. They opened this door, and you see now with things like the New York ZAC and the Illinois Jobs Program, the courts seem to be latching on to that idea that there, in some way, I would agree, there's going to be a fair degree of latitude for a state to do something. But then I contrast that with the 745 decision, which was the EPSA case, in that same term, which then introduced this concept of that if a state practice affects wholesale rates, conceivably FERC can assert jurisdiction or do something about it and within its own jurisdiction. And that to me is an intriguing proposition. When you look at some of these, if a court were decided to adopt more of that language from that line of cases, or when you look at things like what's happening at the edge of the grid, like we had talked about earlier. I mean, it's hard to think that when you start aggregating more and more edge of the grid generation that in a big way affects wholesale rates, that there won't be some sort of claim made to push that jurisdiction further up the chain to the federal level.
I was at I'm going to not use any names to protect the innocent, but I was at a meeting of a lot of utility lawyers. This was probably like 5 years ago, maybe even 6. And somebody made a presentation, and the upshot of which was basically sales from rooftop solar are sales for resale. And he said, how many people in this room agree with me? And everyone put their hand up. And he said, who's coming to FERC with me? And everyone put their hand up. So like, I mean, those things, like I think in an abstract way, seem like a sale for resale to me, and I kind of know what that means about jurisdiction. But I don't know that FERC wants jurisdiction over those sales. I don't think that states want to give up jurisdiction over those sales. But I will say that in November, FERC put out a NOPR on storage that sort of surprisingly also contained a request for information about how you could aggregate distributed energy resources and have them participate in wholesale markets. Sitting in my office, and one of the FERC lawyers who works for us came into my office and he goes, I think FERC is trolling us on jurisdiction. And I go, what do you mean? He goes, read this. And it sort of like seems a little bit arbitrary to say that something is state jurisdictional unless you aggregate it, which is really just an accounting concept, and then suddenly it magically becomes FERC jurisdictional. And then FERC can have some sort of say over the prices. And I think people are going to push on that line eventually. I don't know who and I don't know when, but I think the technology and the way you use the technology and the desire to use distributed energy resources in the wholesale markets is going to push us to have to address some of those questions.
And Emily, to exactly my point is that was really next on the priority list for FERC was this NOPR. It had been out there for a while. It had a storage piece that I think there was seemed to be consensus on, questions about the DR piece of it. But, and RTO is really getting ready to at least, submit their proposals when the
I just want to say I completely agree with Emily on net metering. I mean, at some point, if this is before a court, I think a court would laugh at the status quo policy. They would view it as a pure political accommodation, because the sale, you're not selling to your neighbor. You're not making a retail sale. You're selling to the utility, and they in turn are reselling. That's a wholesale sale. It gets a wholesale rate. And FERC under black letter law cannot delegate its authority to states to set the wholesale rate and use an equivalent retail rate. So I think a court would be, this is not too complicated for a court to understand. Right. And I think they would
We're just never getting there.
What?
We're just never getting there.
I think at very least someone can file a petition at FERC, and if FERC denies it, then you can seek rehearing on that. I think there's a way to get it in front of a court, but I agree I would think I was in that same meeting, and I don't know. I don't think my hand was up in the air either.
Doug, did you?
Well, I was just going to remind people that the whole reason we have a Federal Power Act is because of a Supreme Court case that found that the state powers weren't what people thought the state powers were. And I honestly think that's probably the most likely scenario of Congress sort of doing something big and significant on jurisdiction is either the facts change, the technology facts change, or the market facts change, or a court finds that something people assumed that states could do, they can no longer do. I think those are the kinds of things that might drive Congress to act. I don't really see any consensus for some sort of academic rethinking of where to draw the line now. I don't think people see a need to do that, and I think it would be hugely controversial.
Yeah. Okay, I want to open it up. Please state your name and affiliation, question in the form of a question. Laura. Yeah, it's not working.
Thank you. Hi, Laura Brannon with Bechtel. Something that Michelle said kind of sparked a question in my mind. What was interesting about your example about the processing center in Wyoming is that it was located next to the wind generation. And if part of the problem moving forward is transmission lines and getting transmission lines built, and the long lead time that it takes for that, are we going to see more instances of that where you have, it's almost like a virtual power? You know, I presume that it's much easier to build the wires going from your processing center to the computers that they're connecting to than it would be to build a transmission line from the same wind farms to, you know, the people that would use that electricity. And the only other example I could think of was kind of the ethane crackers that are being built in the Marcellus region, right, where you're co-locating essentially another use for that natural gas as opposed to building a pipeline through New York State to the Northeast that could use it for power generation. So I just wanted to throw that out there to see if there were any other kinds of examples like that where you might kind of get around the whole transmission and distribution issue by co-locating the demand.
I think one of the things, if you don't mind me saying something first, about the project she described is actually the backup generator wasn't just being used to serve their plant, it was actually being used to serve the entire community. And so by definition, that meant that it was going to have to be interconnected to the transmission system. So this wasn't just like just connect her backup generator to her data center. This was connect this backup generator to the entire system so that it can participate in the reliability of the system. I don't think that means it's easier or harder to build those transmission lines. I mean, you might get greater community support for it, but it's not, you know, it's not just like, oh, it's shorter, so it's easier. I mean, and I think that's one of the challenges. I don't think I'm saying anything that Michelle would be surprised at, but when companies say they want 100% renewables, they have to fundamentally understand that once you put the electrons on the system, they go where they go, and so you're not getting the green ones.
You're paying for the green ones.
You're paying for the green ones. You're not getting them.
Yeah, your money goes to the green ones.
But you are changing the, you know,
yeah, and you're
you're
incentivizing the development of more renewables, which is really important, and that's important. But I don't know that it changes the transmission and how hard it is to build transmission.
It's different putting transmission lines locally
Have you ever gone to a local siting discussion?
then exporting that wind electron. You know, if that demand weren't there, then the only other place that it might go would potentially require a cross-state transmission line down to a
yeah. I mean, I think one thing
demand
that is true, and we see this in certain inter-regional projects, is if you've seen it with, I think Clean Line Express is probably a good example going through, I believe, Arkansas, Missouri. I mean, there have been projects designed that are sort of the superhighway type projects, right? Hook up large-scale renewables from the Great Plains into load centers further east, and the pass-through states, sometimes either because of their own state statutory construction, which requires some sort of local benefit for the project, or simply because you have opposition to a project that's designed to, quote unquote, deliver power somewhere else. You're just a pass-through state. Politically, those are tougher to get built, there's no doubt. So it does make it, sort of by virtue of that, it can make it easier to design projects where in some way you don't need to build the long lines. And we've not seen a lot of those superhighway projects, as much as they've been discussed. They, for the most part, have not come together, in part because of that issue.
And the evolution has really been basically these virtual purchasing power agreements where you're paying for it, it's going on the system, and you try and make sure that you draw the area as small as possible where you're part of the service area of your utility, And I think that as there's increased interest, and in some cases pressure to do this more and more locally, you're trying to find where you are that's closer to the facility.
I'd also just revise and extend my comment. You do reach a point, though, with large-scale renewables that without more transmission, you almost by their nature, you have to build them over a large geographic area because you have to balance out things like the intermittency of the renewables, and then you just have the fact that most big-scale renewables like wind happen to be in areas that just don't have large load centers.
I would just add, I think the lesson of Clean Line is if you are in one state, you might be okay. If you're in one state, or if you're in two states, so you have upstream and downstream, but no middle, you might be okay. It's when you get to 3 states and there's somebody in the middle who gets neither the windmills nor the power, then you're in real trouble.
Hi, I'm Judy Greenwald with Greenwald Consulting. I just wanted to make a comment about Bob Nordhaus and then ask a question. My comment about Bob Nordhaus is that we've talked a lot today about how he was there at the creation at a lot of these for a lot of these statutes on both the energy and environmental side. We haven't talked as much how about in the 70s, the energy and environmental policymaking was somewhat parallel and somewhat disconnected. And it was really in the 80s and the 90s that we started to try to integrate it. And that Bob was there at the creation of that too, and was really key because he could speak both languages and knew both sides. And this panel is reminding me that he's the first person who explained to me when I was coming out of 5 years at EPA and going to work on the Hill on climate and energy policy, what FERC does. And not only was it important that I knew that, but it was really important that he was willing to explain it. And so he served as this translator and force, really intellectual force for the integration that we're still trying to do, decades later. So I just wanted to honor him for that, I guess. I wanted to ask about, where do we go from here on climate? Obviously, there's lots of reasons why we're in trouble on this particular issue, but the Clean Power Plan wasn't just, the idea wasn't just, we were going to get this 30% reduction by 2030, but it was supposed to lay the foundation for a path forward that would, over time, get more stringent. The idea was it would set the stage that, states, whether we were right about this or not, would trade with each other. So you're sort of the idea was to set a path towards deep decarbonization and also set the path for where the electricity sector could be the solution for the transportation sector as well. And it can only be that if it's decarbonized. So I'm just wondering if you all have thoughts about, what the hell do we do now kind of question, and I'd be interested.
Thanks, Judy. Thanks. Well, I think we'll posthumously call Bob the FERC whisperer. What next on climate? I was trying to get to that a little bit with, I think there was always this notion of federal leadership on the idea, and that, I often have said to folks, if we were in a different reality and we had a different administration right now, people would be asking, gosh, can't they do more? And I think they'd be looking to the states. So ironically, we may be in that position right now anyway, but what, either from sort of the private sector perspective or from a regulator's perspective, what has that absence of these policies meant for the future of climate policy?
I guess I'll mention 3 things. One is, if there's a replacement rule, even with very modest targets, it could create some of the same infrastructure that Judy was talking about. Like, what are the rules for trading? What are the rules for using carbon emission reductions at other places to satisfy your requirements at a particular coal plant? So it's possible that EPA could sort of create a helpful structural foundation even with very mild targets. I don't know that they have any political interest in doing that, but it might make sense for them to do that, because honestly it would make compliance with even the mild targets more cost effective. So that's one thing. Second thing is, I think Michelle and Google and all of her friends at Walmart and all, I think there's a growing community of people that are figuring out as customers, especially as big customers, but not limited to big customers, how can we use our purchasing arrangements to push for low carbon, high renewable, whatever exactly the policy preference is. And I expect that to continue, and I think as Michelle and her allies in this sort of get more and more experience figuring out how this is going to work, so that instead of having a one-off deal negotiated every time you do a new data center, there sort of becomes a path that people can take if they want to be the next customer. I think that is progress in the sense that it just lowers the transaction costs and sort of gets the institutions, whether they're the utility or the regulator, sort of used to thinking about what are the questions that come up in this kind of fact pattern. And then I think the third is the states, that I think states are going to keep working on this, and I think in the absence, think about all those blue state governors who think they want to be the next president. So this is, it seems to me, something they would want to do in the next 4 years in order to build their resume.
Michelle.
So, for a company, it really starts within our own operations. And so we're talking about what's happening on the renewable energy side, but, Microsoft, we have a carbon fee. We charge each of our business units for their carbon emissions, for their building energy use, for their electricity generation and supply chain, for their air travel, and then we put that into a fund, and then that goes back in to fund projects internally and externally that further reduce emissions. And I think companies are looking at ways that they can do more within their own operations, and then they go to scope 2 and scope 3. What's been interesting to see is this science-based target momentum. We've seen a number of companies now coming forward with longer-term analytic announcements of what they're going to do in each of those pies, and so we're probably likely to see a lot more movement there. And to the states, just to put some more details around it, California expanding its cap and trade program. There's a regulatory process going on in Virginia. You've seen both candidates in the election for New Jersey governor talk about rejoining RGGI. There's likely to be another carbon ballot initiative in Washington state next year, and so I think it's back to that rule book that we saw in the 2000s.
Yeah. One of the things I want to just harken back to what Joe said at the outset of this conversation is we're in a fundamentally new reality where the U.S. is long electricity supply. And this crisis of low prices is causing everybody to try and figure out what their business case is for survival for the future. And I find when talking to people in the electric power sector, most of them have an inkling that they want to skate to where the puck is going, right? They don't want to just sort of only protect their existing assets and ignore what the future is going to look like. And I think a lot of those folks inherently think that's a lower carbon future, whether it's atmospherically, going to be what fits the bill for what the last administration thought was necessary. It certainly does seem there are a lot of folks that are still on board with the idea that the industry and the sector is changing. So. Listen, one of the great things about being in this room is that we can fit all of you. The bad thing is you can actually see the reception outside. And it makes everybody kind of nervously want to get out to the reception. I want to say thank you guys so much for contributing to a conversation that I didn't know Bob as well as everybody, but I think he'd be proud of what we did and how we're talking about these issues. And it's just such a pleasure to have all of you here to do that. I want to say thanks to our friends at Ness, Feldman, Shelley and Kyle and Doug and Charlie for helping us put this together. We'll be grappling with these issues going forward, but thank you very much for giving your time and attention to this panel.
Thank you.